Chapter 165. Night Encounter. After hearing shopkeeper Tian's explanation, Hanli had a better understanding about the treasure talisman. He couldn't help but look at the treasure talisman inside the brocade box once more. This store bought the golden light brick treasure talisman from a small family for a substantial price. It's a brand new treasure talisman, more than enough to exchange for Brother Li's 1,000-year-old spiritual herb. Shopkeeper Tian promptly said in a tone that suggested he was in an unfavorable position. Hanli sneered to himself. He did not believe the act the other party was putting on. At most, they were just fulfilling each other's needs. In shopkeeper Tian's eyes, Hanli's spiritual herb was certainly higher in value than this piece of treasure talisman. What do you think? Which item will Brother Li exchange for? Shopkeeper Tian finally asked with a smile. Hearing this, Hanli hesitated for a moment and couldn't make up his mind. He originally wanted to check out a few more stores and see if there were any better magic tools, but the items in front of him were pretty decent and satisfied him. He was reluctant to give up any of the items, especially that golden light brick treasure talisman. That would be of help to him in the future, so he absolutely had to get his hands on that item. These few items, I like them all. I am planning to have all of them. After considering for a while, Hanli made a decision. He felt like it might not be a bad thing if he just bought everything at the Myriad Treasures store. At least it would reduce the attention he would receive and limit the impact to only the Myriad Treasures store. All of them. Brother Li must be joking. After shopkeeper Tian heard what Hanli said, his face darkened. He thought Hanli was being greedy and unrealistically trying to exchange all of the treasures from the brocade boxes with one spiritual herb. Seeing this, Hanli smiled. He didn't offer an explanation, but rather took out an identical box from his storage pouch and put it on the table. I will use 2,000-year-old spiritual herbs to exchange for all of the treasures in your brocade boxes. Hanli unhurriedly said with control of the matter. Shopkeeper Tian was surprised and overjoyed. He couldn't bother to respond to Hanli's conditions and hastily checked the newly appeared spiritual medicine. When he made sure the new spiritual herb was indeed the same 1,000-year-old spiritual medicine as the first, he then looked at Hanli once again with a strange gaze. After all, a person who could bring out two rare spiritual medicines was worth his Myriad Treasure store's attention. Hanli was wearing a cloak, so shopkeeper Tian wasn't able to clearly see the other party's expression. Because of this, the other party felt even more mysterious. Therefore, after a slight hesitation, he said decisively, "Very well. Since Brother Li says so, I will take a step back and agree to your conditions. But this person surnamed Tian has a small attached request. In the future, if Brother Li possesses any more of such spiritual medicines, I hope Brother will prioritize this store. This person surnamed Tian will definitely offer a price that will satisfy you." Hanli gave a few dry laughs and nodded lightly without giving an actual response, but in his heart he was already sighing, knowing that the other party still became suspicious. It looked like he should limit these types of deals where he exchanged spiritual herbs for treasure as much as possible in the future, else he might attract a fatal disaster. Shopkeeper Tian didn't know Hanli's real thoughts, but seeing that Hanli nodded and agreed, he was overjoyed. If the person in front of him who was surnamed Li could really give him 1,000-year-old spiritual medicine, the price of taking a step back today would have been completely worth it. And so, shopkeeper Tian and Hanli exchanged, and after putting away each of their items, both of them were happy. Hanli left the Myriad Treasure store just like that. He didn't even dare to stay at the market city for even a second longer. He quickly walked past the market city's flying limit, and he immediately flew away from this place. Because he was afraid that the Myriad Treasure store would send some experts to secretly track him, he didn't blatantly fly directly towards Yellow Maple Valley. Instead, he flew straight away from the Taiyu mountain range. After traveling for 3 or 4 entire days, he was then at ease, turned around, and flew back towards the yellow maple valley. During an evening 3 days later, Hanli entered the outer ring of the Taiyu mountain range. Because the sky was about to darken, for the sake of his safety, he found a hidden cave to spend the night in and decided to head back to Yellow Maple Valley the following day. This cave happened to be located halfway up a certain hill. There was even a messy pile of rocks blocking the entrance of the cave. From the outside, it was hard to discover the cave. Hanli just happened to be able to stay inside. After eating something, he changed his clothing, leaned against the stone wall, and started meditating. It unknowingly passed to the second half of the night while Hanli seemed to be asleep, when he suddenly heard the sound of rustling clothes and moving wind. Bang! It seemed like someone outside the cave had landed on the ground on both feet. Hanli was startled and suddenly awoke. Could it be that people from the Thousand Treasures store are coming after me? Hanli couldn't help but think of the worst possible scenario. Junior Marshall's sister, this is a good, remote location. I think this place is it. A familiar male voice sounded outside the cave. Hanli was a bit shocked, but he was finally relieved. If it wasn't the Myriad Treasure store coming after him for the treasure, then the other party was just passing through. There was nothing for him to worry about. Junior Marshall's sister, there's no need to look at me like that. Since you have never enjoyed the feeling of **Zul relationship between a man and a woman, this senior Marshall brother will love you dearly so that junior Marshall's sister will not waste her life as a woman. Your beauty will vanish at any moment, which would be a waste of your fair skin. The man's voice was neither fast nor slow. It was extremely tender, but the contents of his words were truly obscene and ruthless. Hanli breathed in a cold breath of air. Who was the person outside? How could he use this kind of tone and say these **pe first then kill words? It was really impressive. Outside, there was only the sound of the man, but not the sound of the woman. This meant that this junior Marshall sister had already been suppressed. She probably wasn't able to open her mouth right now. But the man's voice was so familiar. He should be someone whom Hanli had seen before. Thinking of this, Hanli's curiosity increased, and he couldn't help but quietly move towards the entrance of the cave. Rip! The sound of the woman's clothing cut through the air, along with the man's indecent laugh. Here, first take a joyful meeting pill. Otherwise it won't be pleasurable. Cough, Junior Marshall's sister. Why do you look at senior brother like that? Actually, didn't you really want to pair cultivate with me after reaching foundation establishment? This could be considered me fulfilling your wish. Ha! The man seemed to be carried away as he laughed hysterically. At this moment, Hanli carefully moved to the entrance of the cave and started peeking outside. A man in white was squatting by a young woman and recklessly caressing her delicate body, pulling down her clothing from time to time. The woman's hair was a mess, so Hanli wasn't able to see her face clearly. But her body was already like a tender white sheep, half naked, revealing her white, bouncy skin, especially her half-hidden and half-revealed bosom. Her breasts were capable of elevating people's blood pressure and deeply evoking a man's natural instincts. So it was him. After clearly seeing the man's face, Hanli was somewhat surprised but also suddenly realized. The man was the narrow-minded Marshall brother Liu, who fought against the Murong brothers. He was a malicious, two-faced person. All Hanli wondered was exactly which poor Marshall sister had become the tiny white sheep underneath his claws. Hanli didn't know if it was because this Marshall brother Liu had heard what Hanli was thinking, but he unintentionally moved aside the messy hair in front of the woman's face. It revealed a beautiful yet extremely vicious face. How could it be her? After Hanli saw the woman's face clearly, he almost bit his tongue. Wasn't this the junior Marshall sister Chin, who had shown affection for Marshall brother Liu from the very beginning? She was already in a relationship with that Marshall brother Liu, So why would this martial brother Liu go out of his mind and play the act of raping and killing his own partner? But as Han Li examined junior martial sister Chen's glaring, fire-shooting eyes, it didn't seem like the normal teasing between couples. Han Li blinked his eyes and was feeling a bit confused. Found it. Suddenly, martial brother Liu stopped pawing the woman and yelled in glee. A tiny, delicate storage pouch appeared in one of his hands. Martial brother Liu stopped paying attention to junior martial sister Chin. Instead, he poured the storage pouch, and out came a large pile of items, such as magic tools, talismans, and private items like the woman's clothing and underwear. Martial brother Liu ignored everything else, and instead went through the items among the jars, bottles, and boxes, as if he were searching for something. Chapter 166, Savage, Ha! I found it. I knew that junior martial sister was certain to carry it with her, and sure enough, I was right. Senior martial brother Liu was wild with joy, finding a small red wooden box after rummaging through her things. He had already opened the lid, but because of Han Li's angle, Han Li could not clearly see what was within the box. His curiosity was extremely great, but he didn't dare to act blindly. It should be known that since this person was so savage as to able to act against his own female companion, if he were to discover this junior martial brother, he was certain to kill Han Li in order to silence him. He would not be left alone. In addition, he previously witnessed the power of the other party's wind attribute magic techniques. Regardless of whether it was used to attack or defend, they were incomparably sharp. How could someone compete against this all-purpose magic? Even more was that the other party's magic power was far deeper than his own, at the center of the 12th layer. Just like that, regardless of magic power or magic techniques, he was at an absolute disadvantage. It appeared that he had no chances of success. But Han Li knew that if he truly fought with his all, he would be able to contend against him. After all, with his original magic tools and the magic tools he had just acquired, he couldn't possibly be a pushover. If that moment came, it would be uncertain who would kill whom. Regardless, Han Li had no interest in using his life to play hero and save the beauty. After all, he had no relations to that junior martial sister Chin. It was she who had eyes but did not notice that she took an ingrate for a lover, thereby delivering herself to him. Who was to blame? Why would Han Li want to put his life on the line for no reason or cause? He certainly didn't have such a great resolve. As a result, he intended to quietly watch this show until the end. Afterwards, when that senior martial brother Liu walked away, he would have nothing to do with him. Naturally, Han Li would be certain to later pay more attention to this senior martial brother Liu. After all, this was the first time he had seen a person capable of becoming this cruel and savage. Seeing him this ruthless, Han Li could only concede defeat. With this thought, Han Li stealthily used the chi restraining technique he had recently learned. He feared that the other party would accidentally react to his existence and cause him to have no option but to fiercely fight to the end. At this moment, senior martial brother Liu placed the small wooden box into his own storage pouch. Then he depravedly laughed several times and moved closer to junior martial sister Chin at his side. He excitedly proceeded to tear away the maiden's clothing while speaking his thoughts to himself, causing Han Li, hidden to the side, to tremble with disgust upon hearing him. Junior martial sister, you mustn't blame me. There is nothing brother can do about this. You should know that crafty and unruly girl, Dong, kindly said that so long as I thoroughly sever my relationship with you and reach foundation establishment, she will pair cultivate with me. She could request that great-aunt ancestor of hers in the sect, martial aunt ancestor Hong Fu, to personally accept me as her disciple, imparting great world-shaking godly knowledge. This is a golden opportunity bestowed by the heavens. This senior martial brother doesn't wish to miss this and therefore has no better option but to wrong junior martial sister. The junior marshal sister Chin lied down on the floor with flames in her eyes. After she heard him empty his heart out, she shook like a leaf from anger, wishing she could immediately get up and ruthlessly bite away at him to appease the resentment in her heart. Unfortunately, this unfaithful lover had earlier used the wind-binding technique to restrict her entire body. She was fundamentally incapable of moving in even the slightest and was even unable to open her mouth to rain curses. She could only move in accordance to his will. After she heard her former lover's words, her limbs became colder, and her face grew pale. Sigh. If Junior Marshal Sister weren't the Chin clan leader's only daughter, I might have let Junior Marshal Sister go. But I am truly afraid of Junior Marshal Sister's love changing into hate, possibly drawing support from the Chin clan's power to retaliate against elder brother. They would also spread this matter to all places, causing elder brother's reputation to fall. In addition, I have also heard people say that Marshal and Ancestor Hong Fu loathes fickle and unrighteous men the most. That is why for Senior Marshal Brother's wonderful opportunity and reputation, Junior Marshal Sister must disappear from this world. Surely no one would suspect me, after all, we were previously such a loving couple. Senior Marshal Brother said this hypocritically. Still, his hands didn't stop in the slightest. Junior Marshal Sister Chen's clothing was entirely torn apart in the blink of an eye, leaving her completely bare. Having seen the beautiful scene before his eyes, Elder Marshal Brother Lu's eyes became even more lustful. His fingers slowly began to slide across her smooth skin, wanting to carefully sample her appearance. He continued saying, however, what tempted me the most was that Junior Marshal Sister, just like me, had actually yet to consume her Foundation Establishment pill. She probably also wished to wait until after a great success in her Foundation cultivation technique to take the pill. After all, if it is taken like that, the odds of achieving Foundation Establishment are slightly increased. As he spouted this out, he clicked his tongue. Regardless, since Junior Marshal Sister wishes to hand it over to Elder Brother along with her untouched and innocent body, it can be seen that she does not hate to part with this Foundation Establishment pill. I am also somewhat worried that taking one Foundation Establishment pill truly is not enough. I fear that I may fail at becoming Foundation Establishment. After all, even if I have mutated spiritual roots, there is still a chance I may fail at achieving Foundation Establishment. However, now that I have Junior Marshal Sister's pill, achieving Foundation Establishment isn't a problem at all. With this said, Senior Marshal Brother Lu withdrew his hands and took out the wooden box he just put away and an azure porcelain bottle. He looked to his left and right hands with a complacent appearance. Having stealthily heard everything while concealed behind a stone, Hanli was lost in thought. All of a sudden, 2 Foundation Establishment pills had appeared before his eyes. This was far too great a temptation. After all, did he not plan to participate in the trial of blood and fire for Foundation Establishment pills? The reason why he brought out his most powerful magic tool, the Azure Flood Dragon Banner, was because he thought similarly to Hanli. He wanted to kill him immediately to silence him. But he absolutely didn't expect Hanli to unleash an overbearing attack as soon as he appeared without saying even a word. Furthermore, his attack was vicious, with an indomitable intent. With no better option, Senior Marshal Brother Lu decided against launching an assault and passed the Azure Banner to his right hand. Then he moved his left hand toward the storage pouch from his waist and took out a yellow talisman. He looked at the high-grade talisman with reluctance before clenching his teeth and threw it in front of him, rapidly muttering to himself. In an instant later, Hanli's steel ring was letting out a faint yellow light. It was not far from Senior Marshal Brother Lu and was about to pound against him. Senior Marshal Brother Lu pointed at the yellow talisman with his free hand and loudly shouted, "Wind Wall Technique, rise!" Following that loud shout, the yellow talisman turned into a white hurricane over 10 zhang tall. It stood in front of Senior Marshal Brother Lu, obstructing the path of the steel ring. Pooh! The steel ring penetrated into the hurricane but was immediately blown side to side. After rotating several times, it was suddenly flung back. As for the spheres that arrived soon after, they were even more useless, only capable of revolving outside the hurricane. They didn't even have the ability to enter the gale. Seeing these circumstances, Han Li's complexion slightly changed. He hastily pointed to the fireballs and immediately turned them into two huge crescents, agilely attempting to flying off in two directions in a futile attempt to further attack Senior Marshal Brother Liu. Hee. Beautifully thought. Senior Marshal Brother Liu coldly laughed. With an extremely skilled, one-handed incantation gesture, he pointed to the center of the wind wall, causing the hurricane to separate into two. They separated extremely quickly and once again obstructed the fireballs. Ping ping. Several sounds of explosions rang. The fireballs were unable to evade once more and could only meet against the wind wall. The hurricane trembled several times, swallowing up the fireballs and causing them to disappear without a trace. Han Li felt overwhelmed with shock. At this moment, under Senior Marshal Brother Liu's control, the two hurricanes turned back into one. Such a minor talent dares to show off his incompetence. Although I know neither the name nor the origin of Junior Marshal Disciple, tonight your death is certain. Senior Marshal Liu said with a savage smile. Soon after, he only saw his hands meet, holding the Azure Flood Dragon banner once more and waving it with all his might. Han Li was somewhat nervous since his opponent was far more troublesome than he expected. Such a swift and fierce chain of attacks had actually been so effortlessly dealt with. Although the opponent waved that banner, nothing unusual had yet to happen, but from looking at the opponent's imposing appearance, he knew that this Senior Brother Liu's counterattack would absolutely be nothing to scoff at. It seems I have no choice but to use the talisman treasure, Han Li coldly thought. However, he was currently unable to make full use of the talisman treasure with a condensation technique. As a result, every time he used the talisman treasure, he would need to fight for a certain amount of time to execute the spell that would propel the talisman treasure to vanquish the enemy. For this reason, his defense must be absolute. With this thought, Han Li took a look at his opponent. He only saw Senior Marshal Brother Liu waving his azure banner. The banner gradually grew brighter and started emitting a blinding azure light, causing the Azure Flood Dragon to become even more sinister and frightening. It seemed the opponent was on the verge of starting his assault. Han Li no longer hesitated and moved his hand. Ooh! The ring flew back and stopped several feet away above his head and began to hover above. Grow! With this soft shout, the steel ring let out a large yellow light and hurriedly expanded. It stopped growing larger when it reached the size of a small table. Fall! That steel ring obediently fell with Han Li at the center of the circle. Then it began to swivel around, forming a large protective barrier. Han Li hadn't stopped there. After he put away the gourd, he took out his newly acquired shield as an offering. It grew several times larger outside the blue light barrier and softly floated in front of him, emitting a black light. Like that, Han Li had 3 layers of defense. His outermost layer was the large and fine steel ring. In the middle was the flying dark iron shield. The innermost layer was the blue light barrier he had used at the very beginning. This time, the wind blades were relatively small but steady and persistent, taking the form of long azure torrents. The torrents rushed forth, causing azure and yellow light to appear from the fierce strikes. This time, Han Li's steel ring was only able to persevere for a short period of time before suddenly producing a heavy boom. Yellow light greatly scattered, and the high-quality fine steel ring finally broke. With nothing obstructing the wind blades, they rampantly charged straight forward. However, they were met by another top-quality magic tool, the dark iron shield. It obstructed their way, and bursts of black and azure light were produced from the collisions. The dark iron shield was very different from the steel ring magic tool. First of all, the ring's quality was a grade inferior. This shield was a top-quality magic tool of the same grade as the Azure Flood Dragon Banner. In the cultivation world, who could possess such rarely seen objects? The steel ring was simply a high-quality magic tool. Although it could not be said to be a commonly seen item since they were widely possessed, the cultivators who had the status to possess one or two of such items were still a sparse few. Secondly, although this iron shield didn't have the slightest potential for attack, as a magic tool specialized in defense, its defensive power exceeded that of even 4 of those steel rings. Not only was it durable and sturdy, but there were also several specialized defensive enchantments attached to the shield, causing its defensive power to greatly increase. As a result, the stream of attacks that consisted of over 100 frantic wind blades was effortlessly intercepted by Han Li's floating shield. It stood like a mountain in a storm and emitted black light. It didn't move even the slightest, giving off the appearance that it had plenty effort to spare. When Senior Marshal Brother Lu saw this, his mind grew furious, but he merely gave a cold snort. He shook out both his hands, no longer releasing wind blades from his banner point. Then he gripped the banner pole, and his hands suddenly emitted a great white light as if a flood of spiritual power was leaking from his body, rushing forth into the banner pole. After receiving such a huge amount of spiritual power, the Azure Flood Dragon Banner's azure light grew even more dazzling, as if there was an azure sun rising in the middle of the night. Few would dare to look straight at it. Because Senior Marshal Brother Lu used too much magic power, his complexion grew extremely pale. However, he still wore a fierce and cruel expression. It seemed he was fully aware that further delay was sure to bring trouble, so he intended to deal a finishing blow at all costs. TL. A long night is fraught with dreams. Further delay was sure to bring trouble. Following a low roar from Senior Marshal Lu, he forcefully tossed the Azure Flood Dragon Banner into the air. Then he performed finger incantation gestures at great speed and pointed toward the banner, shouting, "Flood Dragon Transformation." He was simply unwilling to meet his end in the wilderness against this unknown person. With this in mind, he thought no further. He gave up on the wind blade and wildly channeled all of his magic power toward the Azure Flood Dragon and summoned it toward him. That Azure Flood Dragon banner was truly an amazing wind attribute magic tool. With the entirety of Senior Marshal Brother Lu's strength, it met Han Li's huge sword halfway and once again entered a struggle. Seeing this, Senior Marshal Brother Lu let out a sigh of relief, his body covered in cold sweat. Thus, in the following period of time, Senior Marshal Brother Lu attempted to cast magic techniques several more times, wanting to attack Han Li. However, Han Li used the same technique every time, forcing him to withdraw. Although Han Li hadn't the least bit of protection, he was unable to act against him. Senior Marshal Brother Lu was incomparably sullen and was forced to rely on his deeper magic power, thereby continuing to deplete it. At this moment, Han Li took out various small herbs and such from his storage pouch and stuffed them into his mouth. As he chewed the large mouthfuls, Senior Marshal Brother Lu was dumbstruck. He didn't know what other sinister plot his opponent was planning. He could not guess what his opponent was planning and was baffled, causing Senior Marshal Brother Lu to feel bleak. He had a bad premonition. However, he cherished his life far too much. Although he was far more shrewd than normal people, he had been at his wits' end for a while. As more time passed by, Senior Marshal Brother Lu's heart gradually grew heavier. At last, the Azure Dragon's light began to dim, but the huge gray streak was as dazzling as before. Senior Marshal Brother Lu could not help but be frightened. He shouted out hoarsely, "Impossible! My magic power far exceeds yours. Even if you've been replenished by a mid-grade spirit stone, it is impossible for you to currently have energy remaining. You should have exhausted your magic power before I did." Soon, the Azure Flood Dragon was on the verge of collapse. Senior Marshal Brother Liu yelled out. His shout was like the last bark of a wild dog that fell into a well, full of objection. When Han Li saw his plan completely realized, he could not help but smile. After he heard the opponent's words, his mouth slightly slanted, causing his smile to become a sneer. He didn't have the leisure to explain all of this to a dead man, as killing him was the most urgent affair. He was also almost entirely out of magic power, so how could he afford to waste that effort on the enemy? With that thought, Han Li paid no attention to the opponent's question. He pointed at the huge sword, causing its radiance to become even more magnificent. It gradually whittled away at the azure flood dragon until it was only about 3 meters long. Its azure light was so dim that it could nearly no longer be seen. When Senior Marshal Brother saw this, he became completely desperate. Thus, the desire to stake it all rose in his heart, and his eyes gradually shone with madness. Without speaking, he gradually retrieved the little magic power remaining in the azure flood dragon banner, causing it to return to its original form in an instant and fall from the sky. Then, without regard for the huge sword rushing forth to execute him, he used his remaining magic power to condense a huge wind blade and ruthlessly throw it toward Han Li without the slightest hesitation. When Han Li saw this, his heart trembled. While the opponent rushed to throw the wind blade, he directed the huge sword to behead the opponent. Then, without staying to look at the aftermath, Han Li fled, already rushing out about 10 meters away. After previously receiving the wind blades, Han Li knew of their frightening speed. If he didn't immediately use shifting smoke steps to avoid it, he wouldn't be able to defend himself. He would have been caught unprepared and be cut into two, dying with grievances and unable to rest in peace. The wind blade was truly extraordinarily fast. It already reached the location where Han Li had just fled from. However, it unexpectedly followed the direction Han Li was fleeing in and fiercely shot out once more. Han Li did not think any further and used shifting smoke steps to its greatest extent. In a small area, he continuously shifted left and right, transforming into several afterimages, causing the wind blade that was closely chasing him to be unable to catch up. Han Li clearly understood that if he fled in a straight line, he would certainly be cut down by the wind blade. By using fine and delicate movements, he would be able to defend himself without worry. This was the reason why he dared to abandon his defensive magic technique. Poochie! The wind blade suddenly lost control and disappeared into the earth, leaving a deep groove. Han Li let out a long breath. At this moment, he calmed his panicked heart. Using a movement technique from the mortal world to evade a cultivator's attack was truly a frightening affair. Han Li sat on the ground and then looked across from him. He saw that the wind wall had already disappeared and that Senior Marshal Liu, who had been hiding behind it, was cut into 2 pieces. The 2-pieced corpse laid there motionlessly. Next to it was a huge sword with a dimming radiance. In reality, the moment the talisman was activated, it continued to use a sliver of magic power from its connection to its user, allowing the user to conveniently control the magic technique. If the magic technique did not disappear, the user would continue to be drained of magic power to preserve the spiritual connection. Because Qi condensation disciples were unable to see or interact with these sorts of spiritual threads, in addition to the minuscule amount of magic power used in the short term, a majority of the disciples overlooked this, resulting in false understandings. Although there were several disciples who knew the truth, they felt that this matter was insignificant. As a result, this information was not actively spread among low-level disciples. Wu Feng was one of those few who knew. When he told Han Li this during a casual chat, Han Li deliberately kept it in mind. After several personal tests later, he verified it to be true. As a result, in the middle of that fierce battle of attrition, Han Li remembered this and decisively revoked his defensive magic technique, saving quite a bit of magic power. Although it seemed to be a negligent amount at first, the magic power it would consume was not insignificant after a long period of time. Like that, Hanli relied on this bit of preserved magic power to persevere a bit longer against the opponent. Had he not relied on those two advantages, he might have not been the one who lasted longer. Thus, Hanli undoubtedly felt that this victory had been exceedingly dangerous to have exhausted all of his means simply to save his life. The opponent's strength was truly greater than his own. However, regardless of how the story was told, the one left alive was him. After Hanli felt this pain slightly lessen, he forced himself to stand and started to slowly move, eventually reaching where the Azure Flood Dragon banner had fallen down. He forced himself to pick up the magic tool and delightfully examined it before finally putting it away in his storage pouch. Then, he walked over to Senior Marshal Brother Lu's corpse. After he looked at the extremely bloody scene with slight disgust, he waddled around to look for loot. His storage pouch was easily found on the upper half of the corpse. Hanli impolitely took out the items from the storage pouch and emptied them all out. Soon enough, he saw the case and bottle containing the Foundation establishment pills. Feeling elated, he could not help but look at these items. He hastily lowered his body to pick up the case and bottle. Then he opened them, finding a lustrous blue medicine pill in each container. Although the scent was somewhat pungent, the pills contained formidable spiritual power. Hanli wore a strong smile on his face. He was immediately certain that the Foundation establishment pills were genuine. Even so, he currently had no mind to look through the other goods. After all, this place was where a battle had just occurred. He did not stay there for long and hurried to slip away. Hanli swiftly put away the items and carefully concealed Senior Marshal Brother Lu's storage pouch. He felt a bit of relief and could not help but straighten out and stretch his body. At this moment, he heard the sound of wind behind him, as if something was charging over. Hanli was startled and immediately thought to escape, but he suddenly felt a violent burst of pain from his dantian, causing his body to suddenly become sluggish. Then a fragrant, smooth woman's body energetically embraced him from behind. Hanli was stunned and struggled to get free. However, because of the stabbing pain from his dantian and the fact that his limbs were lacking strength from having just fought, he could not free himself. Under these circumstances, although Hanli already faintly guessed the identity of the person behind him, he could not help but glance behind him. But just as he turned his head halfway, a beautiful and gentle face was already intimately pressed up against him and was incessantly using her sweet lips to madly kiss Hanli. As expected, it was Junior Marshal Sister Chin, who originally could not move a single step. It turned out that this Junior Marshal Sister Chin previously couldn't move because of the wind-binding technique. However, Hanli and Senior Marshal Brother Lu's battle didn't reach her location, so she was able to entirely avoid the battle while lying down. After the fight, she actually hadn't the slightest injury. Before the battle started, the effects of the joyful meeting pill had already flared out, causing Junior Marshal Sister Chin to be delirious with a burning passion. Her eyes were filled with delusion, completely wanting to join together with another person. However, she was bound by a magic technique and was unable to budge in the slightest, still appearing quite innocent. But deep in her heart, she was tormented by greater and greater lustful desires. A moment ago, the wind-binding technique's effects expired and Junior Marshal Sister Chin, who had just obtained her freedom, was brimming with the excitement of lust. Thus she instantly charged toward the sole male nearby, Hanli, and tensely embraced him. From above, this appeared to be an extremely romantic scene. However, Hanli was a genuine virgin. After the frenzy of kisses from Junior Marshal Sister Chin, Hanli felt his mind shake as a peculiar feeling surged forth. Since Hanli had never flaunted himself as a gentleman of honor, Hanli did not feel it beneath him to experience having this woman in his lap. As a result, the passionate Hanli with no trace of politeness reached out from behind him and embraced Junior Marshal Sister Chin. Feeling Han Li's response, Junior Marshal Sister Chin felt even more unbearable. Although she never experienced the affair between males and females, her natural carnal instincts still caused her to begin to tear away at Han Li's clothes. Junior Marshal Sister Chen's actions caused the infatuated Han Li to sober up. He didn't dare to tangle with fire once more and hastily felt for a soul-lock talisman with his right hand. Then, with some difficulty, he aroused the few strands of magic power he had just recovered and used the soul-lock technique to restrain Junior Marshal Sister Chin. Afterwards, he softly struggled to free himself of Junior Marshal Sister Chen's alluring bosom and gently placed the woman on the ground. Chapter 172 Choice. Chapter 172 Choice. At the northern region of the Jian province, at some desert mountain at the border of the state of Yu and the state of Yuanwu, stood several tens of yellow-clothed people of various height. Their clothes were fluttering with the wind, and their ages had nothing in common. There were some who were old and gray-haired with a face full of wrinkles, near the end of their lives, as well as smooth-skinned, white-teethed and red-lipped juveniles who had yet to enter adulthood. They all stood silently in rows. At the front was naturally an imposing old man. With his hands behind his back, he motionlessly looked toward the sky, lost in thought. There were 4 men and 1 woman behind him, each with a respectful bearing. Among them was that martial Uncle Wang who had brought Han Li to enter the sect. He currently had a solemn expression. Behind those 5 people, there were 2 orderly rows of yellow-clothed disciples, all with different expressions. A few were nervous, others were either ill at ease, unconcerned, or even glancing all around. There were a few smiling silently, not showing their true intentions. At the end of the last row, there was a common dark-skinned youth with lowered eyes. He had been looking at the edge of his feet from the very beginning. He didn't dare to shift his gaze in the slightest, seeming unusually shy. However, none of these people knew that this yellow boy was silently cursing with resentment. This youth who was different from the others was Han Li. The group of yellow-clothed individuals were the Yellow Maple Valley's disciples who were about to join the trial by blood and fire. Han Li ultimately decided to participate in this almost certain death excursion. The matter of the 2 Foundation establishment pills was a hapless joke. A month before, after Han Li found the method to take the Foundation establishment pill from Wu Feng, he was greatly shocked. It turned out that those taking the Foundation establishment pill must enter seclusion for 3 months and must use up all of the medicinal power before exiting. Otherwise, the medicinal power would scatter, greatly reducing the pill's efficacy. That was why finding out whether or not one succeeded in reaching Foundation establishment required several months. Having to wait for such a long time greatly discouraged Han Li. His original plan after acquiring the 2 Foundation establishment pills was to first take the pills and then see whether or not he had to participate in the trial by fire. If he were lucky enough to reach Foundation establishment, then he definitely wouldn't go to such a dangerous region. After all, only 1 in 4 survived. It was truly too frightening. If he failed after taking the pills, then it would be imperative that he would enter the forbidden area. If 2 or 3 Foundation establishment pills wouldn't do, then he would refine 3, 4, or even more pills. He was convinced that his aptitude was far too lacking, and only by taking several Foundation establishment pills would he be certain to enter Foundation establishment. However, with the restriction that he must be secluded for 3 months after taking the pill, Han Li's plan was thrown into disarray, causing him to face an awkward situation where he couldn't get everything he wanted. TL. Literal meaning, you can't have both the fish and the bear's paw. Now, he had to either take the Foundation establishment pill and completely give up on entering the forbidden area, or he could temporarily put away the Foundation establishment pill and wait until after the trial by blood and fire to consume the pills. It was impossible to have the best of both worlds. Chapter 173. The gathering. Han Li responded with, "I don't know," to all of the questions, insisting that his cultivation today was all because of his hard work. As for how he was able to cultivate and improve at this alarming rate, Hanley used a mysterious story that he had previously prepared about how he mistakenly ate a magical fruit when he was a child. He told this to Marshal Uncle Wang, then blamed everything onto the magical fruit. He prepared this excuse specifically to handle this kind of situation. Hanley knew that a believable lie should consist of 70% truth and 30% falsehood, so the magical fruit that he described wasn't solely from his imagination. It was a fruit that had been rumored for thousands of years, the immortal clan's dragon scale fruit. It was said that people who ate it could be reborn and could soar in the sky. As for whether or not it truly existed, there was no way for Hanley to find out, but regardless, no one had ever actually eaten it. As soon as this Marshal Uncle Wang, who had read many books, heard Hanley's description of the magical fruit, his eyes brightened up. He actually found an ancient book from somewhere called the Record of Wondrous Objects, and found an article regarding the dragon scale fruit for Hanley to identify. As things had gotten to this point, Hanley would naturally admit it with ease. Amazed, Marshal Uncle Wang made a tisk-tisk sound. Hanley also told him that once he picked the fruit, the plant's original roots immediately withered away and died. That way, there would absolutely be no more of this fruit even if they went back to the original location. This was to make sure the other party would not try asking around in an attempt to find more of the fruit for himself, thereby completely putting an end to the story. As for whether or not this person would be greedy, believed it to be true, or tried to go elsewhere to find another such fruit, it was none of his business. Let him busy himself with it. Hanley knew very clearly that even though Marshal Uncle Wang acted as if he completely believed him, and even though Hanley had answered all of his questions, there was no way of knowing how much he actually believed him. The other party was probably in half belief and half doubt, in between trusting and not trusting. So with this Marshal Uncle Wang, Hanley should avoid and hide from him if possible in the future, as well as pay more attention in case the other party got suspicious. But Hanley believed that as long as he could successfully enter Foundation establishment, then his identity would be quite different. Even if Marshal Uncle Wang still had doubts in his heart, he wouldn't provoke him that easily. After all, the cultivation world spoke with strength. Finally, Hanley brushed off the questions about his own cultivation. As for Marshal Uncle Wang, it was unclear whether or not he was apologetic about all the questionings from before, but he didn't make things difficult for Hanley at the registration. He helped him through all the paperwork very easily, and warned him about some precautions he should prepare prior to entering the forbidden area. Hanley gave a mouthful of thanks, then said goodbye and left. After he returned, he greeted the little old man and temporarily stopped his work at the medicinal herb garden so that he could prepare for the trial by blood and fire without any distractions. Hearing this, the little old man was silent for a while. He used a strange expression that said, "You're already dead," and kept on staring at Hanley. This made Hanley's heart uneasy for a long time. But what surprised him was that before this senior Marshal Uncle Ma left, he gave Hanley 2 bottles of medicine without any hesitation. He said coldly, 1 bottle for internal use, and the other for external use. He then flew away on his flying magic tool with an indifferent expression. This gesture slightly warmed Hanley's heart. After the past 2 years of spending time together, he understood that although the little old man's temperament was eccentric, he was a person with a cold appearance and a warm heart. He was just somewhat absorbed in the art of medicine creation. He was being treated with warmth now, which meant that Senior Marshal Uncle Ma already saw him as his nephew, making Hanley feel moved. 3 days before entering the forbidden area, Marshal Uncle Wang finally sent Hanley a letter, urging him to gather at the meeting hall to get ready to go. When Hanley arrived, the disciples who registered for the trial by fire and blood were all gathered there, silently judging each other. There were more than 10,000 disciples from the whole Yellow Maple Valley that were of Qi condensation. Hanley naturally wouldn't know all of them, but there was still one woman that Hanli couldn't be more familiar with. Not only did Hanli know this woman, he had seen and even touched her whole body, the junior martial sister Qin, who got drugged and almost raped by martial brother Liu. Speaking of which, after martial brother Liu had been killed by Hanli, it caused a small commotion in the Yellow Maple Valley. Even though this person hadn't even reached Foundation establishment, he was after all an owner of mutated spiritual roots, making him a low-level disciple that the sect's upper echelon paid close attention to. As for junior martial sister Qin, after she came back, for an unknown reason, she didn't discuss what had happened on that night to anyone and refused to speak of the matter. As a result, the martial brother Liu, who had disappeared for a long time, was treated as a missing person. After contacting different disciples and searching within the sect without getting any results, this matter was slowly dropped. These types of people disappeared from the valley all the time. It's not like similar situations had never occurred before. Martial brother Liu wasn't the first, and he definitely wouldn't be the last. After the initial reaction period had passed, no one in Yellow Maple Valley ever mentioned martial brother Liu again, as if he never even existed. This situation put Hanli at ease, but he also felt a cold chill. It was expected that most cultivators were people who restrained their desires. If one day Hanli himself disappeared, the reactions within the sect would presumably be not as overwhelmed by the reactions they were having now. Most likely in the blink of an eye, he would be completely forgotten, and no one would waste their time or energy trying to inquire about his whereabouts. Ever since he entered the sect, he had absolutely made the right decision by maintaining a low profile and a cautious attitude. After all, the road of cultivation was very long, so there was a high possibility for accidents to happen. Chapter 174 Martial Ancestrally, Chapter 174, Martial Ancestrally. After they heard Sect Master Zhong Lingdao's encouragements, two honored disciples entered the halls with trays in their hands. One of the trays had a gold-threaded storage pouch. The other tray had a small pile of multicolored mid-grade spirit stones. It seemed it was time to fulfill what was previously agreed. This could be considered the encouragement to fight. Hanli thought this slightly maliciously. The mid-grade spirit stones were basically free for everyone to choose. Hanli already had an earth attribute and a fire attribute mid-grade spirit stone, so he picked a blue, water attribute spirit stone. Nobody fought him over this. However, when spiritual tools were extracted from the storage pouch, the disciples gave cautious glances. This storage pouch was unlike common storage pouches. It only required spiritual sense to store items instead of spiritual power. In addition, any spiritual power that was injected could later be absorbed by the item stored within. This bag also interrupted a cultivator's spiritual sense inspection. So long as one extended their hand, they would be able to take out any stored spiritual tool. As for what item they would take out in the end, it would be hard to say. They could only determine it with the feel of their hand. This storage pouch was specialized to extract spiritual tools and had been refined precisely for this purpose. Otherwise its practicality couldn't be compared to that of common storage pouches, of which case who would use it? Although it was completely filled with high-quality magic tools, defensive magic tools were rarer than offensive magic tools. Furthermore, as high-quality defensive and offensive magic tools, their characteristics were greatly different. If one could take out a suitable magic tool, their odds of surviving the trial by blood and fire were sure to slightly increase. For those disciples lacking magic tools, they would be even more meticulous. However, Hanli did not care. On his previous trip to the city market, he swept clean the entire treasure collection that the 10,000 treasure store had accumulated for many years and was able to obtain 2 magic tools of the finest quality. Not to mention the Azure Flood Dragon Banner as well as other high-quality magic tools he acquired afterwards. To receive just another high-quality magic tool did not excite him. When it was Han Li's turn to step forward, most of the people had already drawn a magic tool from the bag. As for what magic tool they drew, they naturally did not say and did not take them out for others to see. Han Li extended his hand toward the pouch and randomly made a blind grab, acquiring a peculiar-looking object. His heart grew excited, and he instantly put it into his storage pouch while taking a stealthy glance. After a moment of slight distraction, he immediately put it away. At this moment, the person behind him already impatiently moved forward. When Han Li saw this, he tactfully left and returned to the place where he originally stood. With the magic tool selection concluded, a few people came in from outside the hall. They were the many stewards Han Li saw when he first entered the sect. Martial Uncle Wang and that old man Yi whom Han Li truly despised were included among them. These people all had an unusual expression. They all respectfully escorted a square-faced old man at their center. There wasn't even a single person who dared to whisper to one another. The old man appeared 50 to 60 years old with his hair somewhat gray. However, he had a healthy red face and a spirited complexion with a pair of naturally imposing tiger eyes. With a single look, one could tell that this person was of a resolute disposition. After his gaze swept past the disciples, Han Li immediately felt that his had been clearly seen by this person, causing him to be overwhelmed with amazement. Chapter 176 Making a Bet. Chapter 176, Making a Bet, No Bet. Absolutely not. Do you think that I would do the same thing twice? Martial Ancestor Li shook his head as if he were beating a drum and voiced his refusal. No bet. Benefactor Li's standards are actually so high. Does the blood from the inner core of a demonic flood dragon not even enter his eyes? The Daoist priest wore an astonished expression as if he couldn't believe it. However, when Han Li saw his expression, he felt it was very false. Blood from a flood dragon's inner core. Although Martial Ancestor Li originally intended to absolutely refuse to be pulled into a relationship with the Daoist priest, when he heard the name of the item, his expression abruptly changed, and his words somewhat trembled. Yes. If Benefactor Li wants to know about this item, I shall explain. 30 years ago, at the dangerous rapids of the state of Yuanwu's coiling Dragon River, I paid a great price for this item so I could procure it for Benefactor. The Daoist priest calmly and leisurely said while eating up the other party's expression. Impossible. How could the blood of a flood dragon be acquired, not to mention blood kept in its inner core? This is not something that can be said without thinking. Are you making fun of me? Martial Ancestor Li sobered up from his excitement and exposed an appearance of doubt. Is this humble Daoist not a monk? I would not lie. Benefactor can take a look for himself. The Daoist priest did not want to waste time explaining and merely flipped his hand, revealing a white sphere filled with wisps of blood. Martial Ancestor Li's eyes widened, wishing he could rush over and grab it. If Benefactor's horned silver python were to consume this core and undergo secluded cultivation for 10 to 20 years, in all likelihood it would leap from the middle stage of foundation establishment to the late stage. With another 100 years of bitter cultivation, it wouldn't be impossible to enter core formation. The Daoist priest's words were filled with enticement. When Martial Ancestor Li heard these words, he coldly snorted and stiffened his face. It seemed he was unmoved, but his indefinite and flickering gaze exposed the restlessness of his heart. With such a rare wager, why is Benefactor hesitating for so long? Could it be you truly don't think very highly of the strength of your valley's disciples? The Daoist priest curled his lips, goading him to accept. To say the disciples of our Yellow Maple Valley are inferior to those of your Clear Void sect is overcritical. Martial Ancestor Li wore a displeased expression. He swept his eyes past the party behind the Daoist priest and immediately gained a rough estimate of the Clear Void sect's disciples. Their strength was about the same as that of the Yellow Maple Valley's disciples. Fine, I will gamble. However, what treasure of mine would you have me wager? After a moment of consideration from Marshall Ancestrally, he felt that his odds of winning were 50%. With the addition of his extreme longing for that inner core, he eventually nodded and agreed. However, he still cautiously asked that question. This humble Taoist isn't interested in any of Benefactor's other treasures. If he happens to luckily win, then he desires Benefactor to give this humble Taoist 2 equivalent chunks of iron essence 20 years from now. The essence of Benefactor Li's true fire is clear. It is quite famous among the 7 great sects. For you, this is surely a trivial matter. The Taoist priest said with squinted eyes and a smile. Even so, a faint trace of treachery was contained within his words. You want 2 equivalent chunks of iron essence. Marshall Ancestor Li's complexion was unsightly and he almost jumped immediately after hearing these words. You old facetious Taoist, you plan to have me toil bitterly. How is that? So long as you win, you aren't required to. The current cultivation arts you've learned are actually the spoils of war from back then. This was the period when our 7 great sects established ourselves as the lone great powers in the state of Yu. If there are still righteous or evil sects that wish to invade this place, our 7 sects will immediately join hands and repel them. We will absolutely prevent them from establishing themselves. As a result, the cultivation arts our 7 great sects teach include those from both righteous and evil sects along with a few unique ones as well. In the dispute, we could be regarded as neutral. When Marshall Ancestrally said this, he couldn't help but wear a content expression. Previously, you all continuously and bitterly cultivated in the valley. Whenever you left the sect mountains, you've all traveled around the large area of the state of Yu but have never met with the true world of cultivation, nor have yet experienced the dark and bloody side of the cultivation world. However, during earlier periods, on the sides of righteousness and evil existed the 5 great cultivation schools side by side, Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian, devilish and demonic. The degree of chaos during that time exceeds your very imagination, making it seem as if pillaging and genocide were simply common occurrences. With this said, his expression grew completely solemn, but soon after his face relaxed. Then he coldly added, "All right, I'm going to wake you all up a bit to prevent you all from becoming arrogant. Remember that in the world of cultivation, if your strength does not equal another's, don't blindly speak respectful words. This so-called respect can only be given to those experts far above the rest, otherwise you'll be bringing about your own destruction." I wonder how many of you will live to truly comprehend these words after a few days. When Han Li and the other disciples had heard this, they were already at a loss for words and were exceptionally shocked. The words spoken to these disciples were far too surprising. You should have heard the wager we made previously. This particular wager, however, is quite significant to me. So long as I win the wager, I definitely won't treat you all unfairly. Those disciples who help me win will be heavily rewarded. As for the one who contributes the most, I will personally take him as a disciple after he reaches foundation establishment. The Yellow Maple Valley's disciples who still hadn't comprehended the sincere advice were suddenly excited by the grand promise following it. To be able to become an apprentice to a core formation expert, those who received this privilege were but a few tens. This was a golden opportunity that only occurred every 1,000 years. Seeing the crowd before him excited with eagerness in each of their eyes, Marshall Ancestrally faintly smiled and was greatly satisfied. So long as he won this wager, to remember 3 or 4 disciples' names was a trivial matter. At most he would simply settle down in some area and pass down some superficial cultivation arts. Wasn't that matter easily resolved? Chapter 179, Breaking the Barrier. While the leaders of every sect gathered together to discuss how to open the forbidden area, Han Li was not idle. He was sizing up the vicious characters of each of the sections. Toward a few experts at the peak of the 13th layer of their cultivation art, Hanley was calculating whether he could escape or hide behind someone. Hanley absolutely didn't wish for another battle like the one he had with his senior martial brother Liu, and exhaust every last drop of magic power. It should be known that this situation was completely different from that last time. This time, he didn't face a single enemy, but rather great numbers of red-eyed cultivators. If he did not preserve his strength and continuously maintain his power to strike back, he would certainly be one of the first to be eliminated. While he was looking from the side and pondering, Hanley suddenly felt as if someone was staring at him. He was slightly alarmed and could not help but return the gaze. A female disciple from the Spirit Beast Mountain was somewhat evasively looking at Hanley. After seeing her beautiful face, he unexpectedly felt somewhat familiar with her. Hanley was shocked. He recognized that woman. A slim figure appeared from the depths of his memory. It's her, the girl who sold me the golden sincerity brush at the Great South Valley. How did she enter Spirit Beast Mountain set and participate in this trial by blood and fire? The young woman was even more charming than he had remembered, causing him to be somewhat doubtful. However, her easily blushing face remained fresh in his memory, and he felt very favorable towards her. With this thought, he could not help but smile toward the young woman. It was obvious the young woman had clearly seen his smile since her two cheeks were suddenly flushed red. It seemed she was as easily embarrassed as before. The fully bearded man who stood behind the young woman seemed to notice the actions of Hanley and the young woman, and his complexion sunk. He suddenly said something to the young woman in a stern voice, and the young woman's expression immediately paled. She lowered her head silently, no longer daring to look towards Hanley's direction. That man did not let the matter go and stared at Hanley with a malicious gaze. Hanley wrinkled his brow. It seemed the days that the girl spent at Spirit Beast Mountain had been harsh. This fully bearded man was actually one of the vicious characters he had taken note of a moment ago, one of the disciples with a cultivation at the 13th layer. This young woman was being so carefully watched by him, it was certain she had suffered quite a bit. However, Hanley was not a person from Spirit Beast Mountain. Furthermore, once they were in the forbidden area, those who weren't enemies at the moment would become enemies. He naturally did not respond to the provocation and paid no attention to the grimace aimed at him. Hanley's action angered the bearded man until his face flowed with blood. However, he had no method to grab Hanley, and with no better option, he turned his head to the young woman and roared several words in a low voice, provoking the nearby Spirit Beast Mountain disciples until they raised their eyebrows. Most of them glanced at the young woman with a look of hatred. Hanley grew sullen and felt much pity toward the young woman. However, because he was separated by such a long distance, he was unable to clearly hear what the bearded man was saying. Because he did not want to wrong this young woman again, Hanley no longer incited this boor who knew no manners toward women. Though, Hanley was confident that he had sufficient methods to cause this person to seethe with anger without being able to retaliate. At this moment, each of the sect's martial ancestor finished their talks and returned to their sect's disciples. They then brought their juniors into the air, flying toward the famed forbidden area. When the fourth stone word was thrown, the amount of wind blades rushing forth from the azure light clearly decreased by a great amount. With these circumstances, the 6 other core formation experts took the same actions and flew out shoulder to shoulder. Martial Ancestrally held out his hand. A ring-shaped object about a foot long slowly emerged from his palm, releasing a fierce silver radiance. The Daoist priest patted the back of his head and spouted out an inch-long azure light from his mouth. As it flew down the wind, it lengthened, transforming into a flying sword several feet long. The other 5 respectively let out extremely dazzling items: a pink ribbon, a dragon-like walking stick, a huge black-green sword, a long saber emitting red light, an official seal flickering with yellow light. The 7 items from the 7 people enhanced each other's brilliance, creating the appearance of a ring that charged directly into the great formation of wind blades. These were the magic treasures that these experts created after years of bitter temperament once they entered core formation. Each of the sect's disciples didn't dare to be negligent. Under the orders of their foundation establishment seniors, they all stood behind the 7 ancestors in 7 columns, preparing to enter the forbidden area at any time. A burst of loud rumbling sounded out as the 7 magic treasures fiercely fought against the wind blades. All sorts of rays of light shot off in every direction, producing a strange whistle from time to time that caused the disciples who were watching to become very nervous. Martial Ancestor Li's foot-long ring spun and revolved continuously, releasing silver lights that at some moments seemed large and other times seemed small, as if it were communicating with spirits. Countless wind blades struck against it. The azure flying sword transformed into a flood dragon more than 30 meters long. Each of the sword strikes carried a strange cry that astonished one's soul. The other 5 magic treasures were also remarkable, especially that Mei Tiang's yellow seal. It was the most powerful. Each time it crushed down, it was as if a small mountain arose with the sound of thunder bursting out. However, after each attack, it withdrew and returned to its original form. Furthermore, its flight was slow and clumsy. Although the might of the 7 magic treasures were astonishing and the large formation wind blades considerably weakened, it was still incomparably strenuous. Every step toward the wind wall required a great amount of effort. Before long, faint traces of sweat could be seen on the foreheads of these 7 experts. After 6 to 8 hours of fierce fighting, the 7 experts were sweating profusely. However, their magic treasures were finally winning, and they were able to beat open a passage in the wind wall about 3 meters wide. Nobody could see what existed beyond the passage. Quickly enter. We won't be able to endure for long. The Taoist priest took the initiative to yell. Because he had the weakest magic power among the 7, he was also sweating the most. When the disciples of the 7 sects heard this, they dared not be negligent and flew into the passage in alternating turns. At that moment, everyone was silent with dark expressions. They all know that once they entered the forbidden area, everyone would immediately become an enemy of life or death. Even fellow apprentices from the same sect could not be trusted. Hanli stood in the middle rear of the column formations. In front of him was a giant sword sect disciple, and behind him stood a disciple from the saber transformation dock. The passage was not long, simply a distance of 60 meters away. In the instant Hanli flew out of the exit, the scene before him caused him to feel a moment of dizziness. Before his very eyes, the people behind him and the exit had disappeared without a trace. The Black Dragon Pond was located near the outer edges but not in the outermost layer. If he hurried, he would be able to reach the innermost region within a day. With this thought, Hanli didn't dare to use flying tools. Instead, he jumped up a large, lush tree and surveyed in every direction. After he clearly identified the direction, he jumped down. The pool was south of Hanli and happened to lead towards the forbidden area's central area. It seemed he would be able to take a look in passing. Hanli used a concealment technique on his body. Afterwards, he carefully walked forward on the path with quick and light footsteps. It was unknown if it was because Hanli was excessively nervous, but after walking severally on the path, he had yet to encounter anything unexpected. It seemed he was the only person in the Black Dragon Pond area. When he heard the sound of flowing water, Hanli was able to slightly relax his tense mind. After chopping down winding branches that obstructed his path, he was able to see a deep dark green pond. Nobody had yet to approach it. The forest's chilling air already caused Hanli to shiver. This is the Black Dragon Pond. Hanli curiously sized it up. The size of the pool could not be considered large, and its surrounding area was filled with serpent slug trees. However, the surface of the water actually emitted traces of cold chi that could be seen with the naked eye. Even the land next to the pond produced a layer of sparkling ice. The intensity of the pond water's icy coldness could clearly be seen. Hanli did not pay attention to these few things. What he cared about were the tens of bundles of the short white fluffy grass growing close to the water's edge. The grass stalks had 5 leaves and were a pure white all over. They also emitted a faint white chi that enveloped them like smoke. They truly seemed to have a somewhat spiritual appearance. That's right, this must be the cold smoke grass. It doesn't differ in the slightest from the information's description. Hanli muttered to himself, inwardly rejoicing. Although this herb had no relation to his foundation establishment pills, him being able to easily acquire this from the start was truly a good omen. Hanli habitually swept his gaze left and right before walking over. However, his expression suddenly changed. He lowered his body, lightly taking a few steps. After he concealed himself behind a few branches, he expressionlessly looked toward the left side of the dense woods. Not long after, the silhouette of a person flashed by. A blue-clothed man walked out while looking around. From the look of his clothes, he seems to be someone from the heavenly imperial fortress. This person was extremely careful. With each step, he turned his head 3 times and incessantly looked in all directions. It seemed he was firmly holding something in his fist. He should have already made preparations for an attack. He walked toward the direction of the cold smoke grass. Hanli sighed. In addition, he was also fearful of Spirit Beast Mountain's exceptional beast-controlling method. He did not know whether the opponent had any unusual methods of discovering a pursuer, but it would be best to maintain his distance. It should be known that he originally used the small cloudwing bird, which had minor human intelligence, to track and monitor specific individuals from a long distance. It could be assumed that Spirit Beast Mountain also had a similar controlling method. Their methods were certain to be even more crafty and covert. After all, they were cultivators. How could the methods of Jianghu possibly compare? With regards to the cloudwing bird, Hanli felt a bit of regret. When he entered Yellow Maple Valley, in order to prevent arousing attention, he released the bird into the Taiyu mountain range, allowing it to freely move about. As a result, the bird frequently returned to look for its master, Hanli, for its favorite food, the yellow chestnut pill. However, after a long period of time, it gradually returned fewer and fewer times. By the time Hanli realized his mistake, the bird had already become wild and had actually flown to some faraway land, never to be seen again. This caused Hanli much heartache, as it would have been of much use on this journey within the forbidden area. What Hanli did not know was that his decision to take a roundabout route truly allowed him to escape calamity. After the 2 disciples from Spirit Beast Mountain left the Black Dragon Pond, each of them released rainbow moths over a large area. These beautiful flying insects immediately scattered in every direction, densely spreading over an area of about 300 meters. The color of their bodies then gradually changed, slowly matching with its surroundings. The colors of their body blended in so well that they could not be easily seen without a careful examination. Furthermore, even if a few careful people discovered these moths, they would most likely believe them to be native to the forbidden area and not suspect them. Thus, these colorful moths became natural sentries for the 2. So long as someone entered their range of awareness, they would immediately alert the 2 and allow them to plan a response in advance. These numerous insects formed a living alarm network. As alarms, they could be said to be flawless, an expert trick known to Spirit Beast Mountain disciples. Although disciples of their own sect would know of this beforehand, they would have no method of passing through the moths and mounting a sneak attack against the 2. Actually, with regards to Hanli's decision at Black Dragon Pond, it could be considered a great fortune. Those 2 from Spirit Beast Mountain did not yet release the rainbow moths at the pond and only released them after leaving. Otherwise, Hanli would not have escaped their notice. This wasn't a matter of negligence or forgetfulness. The moths were naturally fearful of the cold. If the temperature was a bit too low, they would freeze and die one by one. Furthermore, it wasn't weak, and was actually truly interesting. The young woman lightly raised her sharp chin with opened eyes, showing an expression of considerable interest. If Hanli had heard those words, he would only be stunned with fear. Her words were far too accurate. With just a few words, she was able to sinisterly point out his strengths and weaknesses as if she understood him more than himself. "I'll let you go for now. I am still preoccupied with other business. However, the next time I see you, young fellow, I won't let you off so easily," the young woman said with a bit of unwillingness as she wrinkled her nose, creating a mischievous crease. It was as if Hanli had become her newly acquired toy. She was greatly interested in him, causing her to regret having to leave. In the end, the young woman pouted with her small mouth and took out a talisman. With a wave of her hand, she was enveloped in dazzling green light and disappeared. If there was someone present who had saw that scene, they would perhaps immediately feel heartache and loudly curse this woman's clan, hoping it would wither. She actually squandered a talisman that was rarely seen in the cultivation world, a wood evasion technique talisman, as she pleased. That was an elementary mid-grade talisman. It should be known that if an average person had this wood evasion talisman, although it wasn't enough to be a family heirloom, it was something that could only be used in a matter of life or death, since its most optimal use was to escape death. Hanli did not know any of this, so he naturally felt no heartache. Even more so, he couldn't have known that there was a woman who was greatly interested in him and thought about him often. He still believed that he had lightly escaped from a predicament and was currently rejoicing. Regardless of whether or not there was truly someone there, Hanli did not intend to look into it further. After all, the closer he approached the central area, the more common enemies would become. They would set up similar ambushes, and attacking others would gradually become a common occurrence. To preserve his own life, he must spare no effort to avoid all sorts of unnecessary conflict. That was Hanli's current plan of operation. Besides, it wasn't as if Hanli gained nothing from those two corpses. With this thought, Hanli held out his hand. There was a ball of transparent thread in his palm. As he departed, he picked up that item in passing. It was the thread-like magic tool that had been used to kill the giant sword sect disciple. Hanli poured a bit of magic power into the magic tool, which gradually became taut and straight. In the end, it unexpectedly became a perfectly straight thread over 30 meters long. Hanli controlled and waved the thread as he wished for a moment, and he immediately felt that this item had clever uses. After he was finished, he truly thought this was the perfect weapon for an ambush. Because of its near-invisible properties and its incomparably sharp and completely flexible cuts, Hanli could confidently behead his opponents without them even knowing. Chapter 183 Harmonic Spiritual Talisman. Chapter 183 Harmonic Spiritual Talisman. Hanli tasted some bitterness from his mouth. He did not think that as greatly careful and tremendously cautious as he would still be ambushed. Furthermore, it was one of the worst possible circumstances, between two people. Currently, he was in a zone called the skyline. Its environment was extremely dangerous. If one did not use flying magic tools, the entire region only had a narrow small path that led to the central area. Lining the two sides of the small path were incomparably steep cliffs. Although Hanli was not weak in the light body martial arts of the mortal world, he would not dare to rashly climb them. As for flying directly over with flying magic tools, the idea was even more absurd. It would be a suicidal action, openly allowing others to launch an attack. Why even think of it? None of the sect's disciples would ever perform such folly. Furthermore, the bitter experiences of his predecessors taught him that flying was an absolutely prohibited action in the forbidden area, else one would leave a corpse. When Hanli entered the vicinity, he hesitated for quite a while. However, he ultimately didn't dare to take the shortcut by flying over the mountain peak. As a result, he was forced to openly follow the small road on foot. Naturally, Hanli was completely wary of the dangers in this area. On the entire way, his nerves were tightly strung. But even so, just when he had walked through the path opening, his path was blocked from the front and back by two people without even the slightest warning. When Hanli saw the bearded man's fierce expression, he knew that to talk arrogantly at this moment was of no use at all. First he slapped the defensive water barrier talisman on his body, and then he brought out the flying dark iron shield. Additionally, he took out the magic tool, gold beetle swarm blades, and his few elementary high-grade earth prison technique talismans. The fully bearded man and the person behind him looked at Hanli's actions with cold eyes without the slightest intention of stopping or attacking him. It seemed the two were completely confident, they felt entirely certain that they could handle Hanli and appeared calm. This was no surprise. The person behind him was already at the peak of the 12th layer. Not to mention the fully bearded man had already cultivated to the 13th layer. Facing an 11th layer fledgling such as Hanli, they naturally felt that it would be a trivial matter. When Hanli saw this, he licked his dry lips and inwardly sneered to himself. Since his opponents were so negligent, he would naturally exploit this opportunity. Thus, remaining completely calm, Hanli faced his body to the side so that his enemies were to his right and left, as if they were horns, to avoid being attacked in the back. As expected, these two did not take the opportunity to attack jointly. These were the strongest enemies he had ever faced since he entered the world of cultivation. Even so, Hanli wasn't fearful of them in the least. Although he did his utmost to avoid fighting with others, it wasn't because he had no confidence in himself. Even though Hanli's magic power was greatly lacking and would be a disadvantage in a battle of attrition, the top-quality magic tools and the treasure talisman he possessed were enough to make up for this deficiency. Furthermore, if it truly did not work out, he could take out the Heaven's Lightning Child and eliminate a person. Was that not an easy matter? But whether or not he was willing to use it was an entirely different matter. However, Hanli had a bit of doubt. Why would the fully bearded man and the heavenly Imperial Fortress disciple not fight one another and instead team up? If they were disciples from the same sect, it would be an ordinary matter. Chapter 184, Might of the Golden Light Brick. When the fully bearded man saw Hanli with his hand still on the talisman, he was not worried. The wood attribute defensive barrier he wore had frightening defensive power that could fundamentally ignore common attacks. Furthermore, on the basis that his opponent was a novice who cultivated to the 11th layer, he didn't believe that he could possess a talisman of great strength. At most, it would be an elementary mid-grade talisman. Because of this, he continued to walk forward without taking notice, opening his pouch as if he were about to bring something out. But when he was suddenly rooted in place by the yellow light barrier which he recognized as the earth prison technique, the fully bearded man's expression finally changed, realizing that things had taken a turn for the worse. At this time, a strange dark green snake with a pair of purple wings leapt out from his pouch. As soon as it appeared, the snake immediately made a few odd gwa-gwa cries and began to viciously attack the yellow barrier, causing the barrier to tremble continuously. Its strength was not small. When the fully bearded man saw this, his spirits were slightly lifted. He took out another pouch to release another spirit beast, hoping to combine their efforts to break through the earth prison. He was confident that he would be able to escape in a short period of time. When he escaped, he would definitely pull out his opponent's ribs one by one to quench the hatred in his heart. Hanli didn't even pay attention to his surrounding enemies. In a swift movement, he rushed towards the man from the heavenly Imperial Fortress. His movements were quick, and throughout the whole way he seemed to be darting in and out of view, even leaving behind a series of afterimages, making him seem almost phantom-like. At the same time, Hanley gently patted the storage pouch near his waist. The original gold beetle swarm blades suddenly switched with another similarly small magic tool that he clutched tightly in his hand. At this time, the man from the heavenly imperial fortress finally awoke from his beautiful dream, instantly seeing the strange scene unfolding in front of him. His expression changed dramatically. He hurriedly backed up and flipped his palm, causing a talisman to appear. Meanwhile, Hanley was still at least 30 meters away from him. The man relaxed, thinking that there was more than enough time to cast the talisman. However, before he was able to use his spiritual power to activate the talisman, he was stunned to see that the charging Hanley suddenly smiled mysteriously at him. In turn, one of Hanley's hands gently waved at him, a movement similar to a greeting between two familiar friends. At the same time, he also felt a slight itch on his neck, as if he had been bitten by a mosquito. The man from the heavenly imperial fortress stared blankly, yet to realize the other side's intention. In a moment of turmoil, his eyes dimmed as he lost consciousness. Brother Yen. Standing off to the side, the fully bearded man from Spirit Beast Mountain involuntarily cried out with wide eyes, having seen the whole thing clearly. He personally saw that Hanley was able to kill his close friend with a simple wave of his hand from about 3 meters away. His friend's head rolled on the ground with a goo-loo-loo sound, separated from its body. However, the now headless body continued to back up a few steps until it fell over on the ground, blood spurting from its neck about a few feet high with hoo-hoo sounds. The fully bearded man suddenly felt his hands and feet turn ice cold with a cold sweat down his back. The methods the opponent used to kill his friend were too demonic. He had seen clearly that his friend was killed without contact, and the opponent for sure hadn't used any kind of magic technique. Boy, as soon as I get out I will hack you to pieces. Although he felt beads of cold sweat exuding from his forehead and was filled with grief for his friend, the fully bearded man maintained a menacing attitude to strengthen his courage, bracing himself and standing firm. In actuality, however, he had decided in his heart that as soon as he escaped from the earth prison technique, he would immediately run far away, biding his time. Revenge was a dish best served cold, after all. The boy in front of him was too strange. Not only did he have the high-grade earth prison technique talisman, but he also could kill people with invisible weapons, making him truly difficult to deal with. Getting revenge for his friend is indeed important, but first he must preserve his own life. It turned out that the seemingly ferocious fully bearded man was actually a person as cowardly as a mouse that bullied the weak yet feared the strong. Most people would be surprised by this. Of course, Hanley had no way of knowing his opponent's thoughts. All he saw was that the opponent had released another pangolin-like beast that, along with that strange snake, had begun to fiercely attack the yellow barrier. The fully bearded man had also taken out a pair of iron rod-like magic tools to aid the two beasts in smashing the barrier, causing it to flicker with light incessantly. The earth prison technique could not be maintained for much longer. As soon as Hanley realized this, he took out his golden light brick treasure talisman with one hand, bringing it in front of his eyes and staring at it intently in order to activate it. If he were to use any other normal magic tool, he simply could not feel at ease. His opponent, after all, was a 13th layer expert. If he was unable to kill him with one blow, there would be big trouble when his opponent escaped. Until now, he still remembered the exhausting battle with Senior Marshal Brother Liu, and at that time Senior Marshal Brother Liu had only been at the 12th layer. Despite this, he had not expected that he could actually use the transparent thread to finish off a 12th layer opponent. However, the fully bearded man was already on guard and would not be defeated so easily. The fully bearded man under the earth prison technique, seeing the weird movements of the talisman in Hanley's hands, felt his heart tense. He tightened his grip on the pair of black iron cudgels. But the yellow barrier of the earth prison technique was extremely strong. Even if it had changed shape and darkened to the point of being in danger of fracturing, it continued to maintain its integrity. Upon seeing this, the fully bearded man became so angry that he almost vomited blood. At this time, he suddenly felt a gust of an astonishing amount of spirit power rocketing up from Han Li's direction. He couldn't help but slowly turn his body and look in his direction. He saw Han Li's hand emitting a strong golden light, and a lustrous, shining golden rectangular object slowly rose up, floating in midair. Treasure talisman. The fully bearded man's expression changed dramatically, and he began to yell in terror. He had realized the nature of the golden light brick. What he didn't know, however, was that Han Li's face at this moment was also deathly pale with alarm. The floating object was furiously draining all of his inner magic power steadily, without any way of stopping it. It seemed as if it would suck him dry. The quietly complaining Han Li, as he was suffering, began to curse the store that had sold him this item. How is this a treasure talisman? It's clearly a leech that wants to kill me. However, when a third of his magic power had been drained, the treasure talisman finally stopped its wild movements and calmed down. Control over it once again returned to Han Li. At this time, Han Li did not hesitate and pointed, causing the golden light brick treasure talisman to immediately shoot out. It flew straight towards the fully bearded man, who was still trapped under the earth prison technique. His face became ashen from fright. The golden brick began to expand, and in the blink of an eye, it became as large as a room. Spiritual chi revolved around it and radiated golden light in all directions. Its pressure was truly astonishing. When it reached the fully bearded man's forehead, the golden brick was like a small mountain in size, and it came down with a violent clap. Pang! Ah! After the loud sound and fully bearded man's blood-curdling scream, the entire earth shook violently. Han Li was both surprised and happy. His expression was somewhat strange. Was it really possible to eliminate a 13th layer disciple that easily? Han Li had some doubts. As soon as he retrieved the treasure talisman, the golden light brick immediately returned to its original form and flew back into Han Li's hand. An extremely large crater had formed in the place where the golden brick had slammed into the ground, almost 30 meters wide and a meter deep. As for the fully bearded man and his spirit beasts, they had become a pile of mud, indistinguishable from one another. The fully bearded man really had been killed. Han Li was at a loss. It was as if he couldn't resist a single strike in the slightest. Was it that the fully bearded man was too weak or that the golden light brick was simply too strong? Han Li was unable to decide. However, after generating such a loud noise, it was no longer safe to stay in this place. Han Li quickly became sober. After he destroyed the 2 corpses, he took the 5 or 6 storage pouches and left the area, leaving the skyline. Continuing to walk forward would most likely have led to a large forest, which was incidentally also an ideal place to ambush and kill people. Perhaps after entering the forest there would be another fierce battle waiting for him. Thus, before entering, he decided to find a place to rest a little and restore his magic power in order to protect himself. As for the other disciples of the same schools, they were at the most cannon fodder, meant to aid the plans of their various sects. This group was elite, their magic power was profound, complemented by magic tools with astonishing power. They only had one goal, which was to kill all the disciples of other sects and steal away enough spiritual medicine. The extent of the first massacre at the start lay in their mutual, wordless understanding to first get rid of the trash and all those who were only there to take advantage of the situation. This was to prevent these people from obstructing their movements and, in general, any problems from sprouting up. In addition, the news that someone had been one step in front of them to the central area did not make them panic or become edgy. Entering it was easy, but if they wanted to bring spiritual medicine out, that would be incredibly difficult. The massacre continued to progress, but because Hanli was still a distance away from the central area, he was still not able to involve his recovered self. However, other weaker members were not as lucky as Hanli, and many were brought into the middle of the massacre even as they desperately struggled to free themselves to protect their own lives. And Saber Transformation Doc Su-air was one of these people. Today, Su-air's face was deathly pale, staring at the person in front of him with an expression of pure terror. This person was big and was carrying a giant silver sword. It was this person who had, right in front of Su-air, already killed the other two disciples from Saber Transformation Doc. Under his giant silver sword, it didn't matter what kind of high-grade weapon and protective armors were used, it was as if they couldn't even withstand one attack, being ripped apart one by one as if they were thin paper. They were inevitably sliced in two. However, it was because there were those two other disciples from the same sect that Su-air, seeing that the situation was far from good, seized the opportunity to slip away, falling into confusion as he ran. Unfortunately, the big man didn't seem to have the idea of letting him go, instead persistently chasing him for a few dozens of hours and finally catching up to him here. This caused him to thoroughly lose hope. "If you kill yourself, I can leave you an intact corpse," said the big guy expressionlessly and with a cold glare. You can go die." In the midst of his hopeless situation, Su-air, who knew that he would not live much longer, erupted in fighting spirit. He took the only two high-grade magic tools he had on him and, in one breath, threw them all out. "Idiot!" The big guy spoke this very deliberately. Next, the huge silver sword flew from his back into the air. As if without effort, the two magic tools were broken into pieces. In the same motion, Su-air was also cut into two pieces. After finishing all of this, the big guy did not even bother to look at Su-air's corpse. Instead, he spun on his heel and left without even the idea of moving towards the storage pouch. To him, the only magic tool he needed was the huge silver sword. Any other magic tool or precious item would only distract him and would be a big hindrance to his cultivation. At the same time, at a small brook near the central area, a female disciple of the Masked Moon sect controlled a magic tool like a scarf while drenched in sweat. She was currently bitterly defending herself from two red, shiny daggers, but it seemed as if at any moment she would be unable to defend herself any longer. "Could this senior martial brother wielding daggers please let this junior martial sister go? I am willing to serve senior martial brother with my body tonight." Since this woman was at death's door and was past caring about shame, she used a woman's greatest advantage and tried to seduce him. But would it succeed? Based on their encounters and the tactics he had used, she had absolutely no idea. "Fine, withdraw your magic tools and I'll agree." The person speaking was an 18 or 19-year-old male wearing a earthy-colored robe. He had delicate features, red cheeks and white teeth, all the characteristics of a delicate, handsome male. Having said this, he stopped his two daggers in midair and lightly smiled at the woman. The Masked Moon sect female was delighted and hurriedly gave him two winks. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly allowed the scarf to descend, retrieving it into her hand. Then, she stuck her breasts out, as if she was about to say something. Unfortunately, before she could open her lips, the handsome male's face suddenly expressed a killing intent. His finger violently pointed, and in a surprising turn of events, two red flying daggers immediately cut in a crisscross. The woman, without a whisper, fell to the ground, fresh blood puddling on the floor. SL*T. Even someone as common and unrefined as you thinks that they can seduce me, Han Tianya. Note, the Han, used here is different from Han Li's surname. The handsome male's face bore an expression of disgust, his voice suddenly becoming intense. Next, he took out a pleasant-smelling handkerchief from his waist, delicately wiping the dust on his face. His movements were very gentle and reserved, as if he were an unmarried daughter of a noble household. "I should hasten my journey, perhaps there will be others along the road who will also provide some entertainment," After thinking this aloud, the male carelessly tossed the handkerchief he had used to wipe himself onto the female's face, leaving with a swagger. Deep in the forest, a disciple of the spirit beast mountain lay dead on the ground. A yellow-robed, middle-aged man stood nearby. He was currently shaking his head and staring at the sky, mumbling something to himself. Behind him were a few extremely fierce beasts lying on the ground, not moving, without a breath. On top of the barren mountain, an ugly-faced, green-robed man was frantically controlling about a large swarm of huge bees, besieging a few people dressed like Taoists. Just like that, the strong massacring the weak could be found everywhere in the forbidden area. Although Hanli did not see all of this, he could faintly smell a bloody scent drifting through the air. However, he had no time to look into the whole story, instead sitting on the treetop without moving, gradually restoring the magic power in his body. The time passed by very quickly, and more than half of the first night in the forbidden area had already gone by. What shocked Hanli was that in this area, the amount of extremely bright light was the same during both daytime and nighttime. The entire sky was always an overcast color, making people who saw it feel somewhat unsettled. When his magic power had been restored enough and as Hanli was rejoicing quietly in his heart, the sound of hurried footsteps and heavy gasps suddenly came from far away, slowly getting closer. It was as if there was someone running towards the very tree that Hanli was meditating on. Chapter 186, Making a move. The corners of Hanli's mouth moved slightly. He couldn't help but curse in his heart, but his tightly closed eyes had no choice but to open. Although his magic power was still a tiny fraction from being fully restored, there was a person coming his way. He didn't dare arrogantly continue to meditate, especially under conditions where he didn't know how things stood with the person who was coming. Which senior martial brother is here? Quickly save this little sister. A woman wearing yellow robes came running out from the nearby forest, staggering to the bottom of the tree where Hanli was. She wore an expression of panic and raised her head to the treetop, calling for help. It was as if she had determined that up there was her own knight in shining armor. Not too far behind her, a person's white shadow walked over unhurriedly. Their behavior sharply differed from the woman's terrified appearance, as if they were feeling quite leisurely. Seeing all this, Hanli rolled his eyes. He was very unhappy with this woman's behavior of inviting disaster. As for her ability to discover the location of his hiding place, he did not find it surprising. Before all of the Yellow Maple Valley disciples had departed, sect leader Zhong Lingdao made use of a type of pulling magic that allowed these disciples, within a certain range, to perceive each other's position. Of course, this magic had a time limit on it, being only effective for 10 days. The purpose of this magic was to allow disciples of their own sect to support each other, thus greatly increasing their likelihood of success. It is said that the disciples of other sects were also under the effects of a similar magic technique. Hanli, having no other choice, gave the woman a glance. He actually recognized her. She was a fellow female disciple that stood together with junior martial sister Qin. Apart from her figure, which could comparatively stir up many fires, her appearance was extremely plain. After Hanli had coldly stared at the woman's desperately pleading appearance, he did not carelessly and immediately jump off the tree. Instead, he closely sized up the white shadow following her through a very small gap in the leaves. Regardless of whether he saved the woman or not, Hanli wanted to gauge whether the magic power of the oncoming person was strong or weak before deciding. He did not want to stake his own small life for a woman who was a total stranger. If the white shadow's magic power was average, Hanli would of course make a move and kill them without any respect, thus acting as a hero saving a beauty. However, if their magic power was frighteningly deep, Hanli had to carefully consider whether he would join up with the woman under the tree to escape together, or if he would instantly escape without a trace. However, to prepare for any situation, he still placed his hand on top of his storage pouch, retrieving the golden beetle swarm mother blade, magic tool and a defensive talisman. In addition, he took the nameless transparent thread and deftly wrapped it around his finger. "Z's, your running looks really ugly. Are all of Yellow Maple Valley's female disciples as useless as you?" The white shadow slowly walked closer, revealing their real face. In fact, it was a woman in her prime, wearing a white, flowing shirt. Her face also had some pleasant features, but her two eyebrows were slightly lifted, and she wore an evil expression. Although she spoke this word to the yellow-robed female under the tree, her eyes with killing intent kept drifting towards the top of the tree. It was evident that she was not as arrogant as she had said about herself. She still had some misgivings towards the hidden Hanli who would not reveal himself. 12th layer cultivation. Having easily seen the opponent's cultivation depth, Hanli's heart let out a breath. However, he still had a few suspicions. Hanli was disinclined to respond to his opponent, instead picking up his golden light brick treasure talisman, steeling himself for the experience of having his magic power savagely sucked away again. But at that moment, from the thick forest behind the woman suddenly exploded a huge amount of spiritual chi from a terrifying source. Hanli stared blankly. Before he was able to react to what had happened, a yellow tip streaked by flashily, shooting out from the depths of the forest like lightning. In an instant, the streak shockingly penetrated through Hanli's azure rope, the woman's barrier, and the white-clothed woman herself. Before the white-clothed woman was even able to cry out, her body had already toppled over where she had stood. Hanli's initial reaction to this scene was one of shock, but he quickly thought of something and wanted to act. However, it was already too late. A blue shadow flashed a few times, as if it were a meteor chasing the moon, and appeared next to the corpse of the woman. In one swift motion, he ripped off the storage pouch on her waist and began laughing loudly, revealing an expression of ecstasy. Having already been a step too late, Hanli sighed, vexed. However, thinking of his own small life, he still strongly braced himself, coldly gazing at this person's every move. The arriving person was a middle-aged man whose face was full of scars. His two eyebrows were slender, and he had a nose hooked like an eagle's beak. His whole body contained an evil chi, causing people who saw him to immediately tremble and want to show respect from a distance. Hanli, upon seeing that his cultivation was actually at the peak of the 13th layer, felt a heaviness in his heart. Feng Yu, you are the savage Feng Yu of the Heavenly Imperial Fortress. Unexpectedly, before the blue-clothed person was able to open his mouth, the yellow-robed female yelled out in dismay. The expression on her face was as if she had just met one of the scariest demons. She was even much more afraid than when they had been chased by the white-clothed female. Hee hee. I didn't expect that this girl would recognize this uncle and obediently stand there. After uncle sees how the harvest is, I'll come to deal with you. The blue-clothed person merely glanced at the yellow-robed female before lowering his head and searching through the storage pouch right before their eyes. Hanli rubbed his nose and dully watched this person as his eyes flickered. Although he didn't know the great origins of this person, he was greatly displeased with the senior martial sister's habit of making a big fuss out of nothing. As far as Hanli was concerned, it didn't matter who the oncoming person was, his own position could not become disordered. The stronger the enemy, the more he had to remain calm. He glanced at the magic tools that were now free and stretched out his hand, causing the golden blade and silver hook to return to him. The golden blade was still all right and was as new as it was before, but the silver hook's appearance gave Hanli quite a fright. How do you want to die? Is it for me to cut you into pieces, one piece at a time, or do you want me to cook you inch by inch with a large fire? When the yellow-robed female heard this, her body trembled, and her face became deathly pale beyond comparison. She could no longer withstand the fear in her heart, and she secretly looked around to her left and right, beginning to come up with other ideas. "I want you to die," Hanli replied with a light smile. His smile was very natural and light-hearted. His use of the flying dark iron shield to directly counter the opponent's treasure talisman with force had actually been quite risky. If the opponent's treasure talisman was powerful beyond his expectations, then his head would have hit the ground a long time ago. When Hanli and Senior Marshal Brother Liu had battled, the Azure Flood Dragon banner had been able to hold out against his flying gray sword talisman for half a day. Even if Feng Yu's small blade was somewhat stronger, the flying dark iron shield could probably withstand it for at least a short time. It was only because of the above reasoning that Hanli was willing to take this risk. Seeing that he temporarily didn't need to worry, Hanli immediately grabbed the golden light brick talisman in his hand, preparing to activate it and shoot down the opponent in one blow. But before he was able to rotate the spiritual power in his body and begin to cast the talisman, Feng Yu suddenly yelled out, "SL*T. Where are you trying to run?" Then his body image flashed. He appeared in a nearby patch of dense forest, blocking someone off. The person who was trying to sneakily run into the dense forest was none other than the yellow-robed woman. It turned out that this woman, seeing that her odds of success were low and recognizing Feng Yu's fearsome reputation, became fearful in her heart. She decided to use the moment while Hanli and Feng Yu were battling to run away, fleeing without a trace. Hanli had long noticed this woman's activity. Although he was somewhat resentful in his heart, he wasn't interested in doing anything about it. Since she seemed to be unable to help if she stayed, if she wanted to leave it was up to her. However, she had first betrayed their agreement of cooperation, so he would not try to prevent her from attempting to flee. On the other hand, he would no longer help her. Whether she survived or perished depended on herself alone. Hanli had coldly decided to ignore this woman, but the fury of Feng Yu was still burning, and he would not be so easily deceived. He had long ago developed a strong hate for both Hanli and the yellow-robed woman because of the words that Hanli had spoken. When he saw this woman trying to flee, he was naturally unwilling to let her go. This was why he suddenly flew to block the yellow-robed woman's path. When Hanli's senior martial sister saw this, she was so frightened that she became like a mortal, turning around and running. All of her magic skills had been forgotten. When Feng Yu saw this, his ugly face throbbed a few times, and he slipped away, again standing in front of that woman. He raised his hand without hesitation, causing his large hand to glow with yellow light. He then inserted this hand directly through her chest, protruding out her back. The hand became a bloody hand that dripped with blood. The yellow-robed female's corpse fell to the ground, her eyes opened wide. However, her eyes had lost their vigor. Before she died, perhaps she regretted her rash decision to leave Hanli's side, but there was no medicine for regret that she could eat in this world. Based on the fact that the opponent had no more magic tools or strong talismans left, Feng Yu, having just slaughtered the yellow-robed female at close range, removed his hand and purposefully licked the blood still dripping from his finger. Then, he smiled maliciously at Hanli. When the Hanli hiding inside the shield saw this, his face turned green, and he pressed his lips tightly together. Although he didn't yell out, he had definitely been scared out of his wits, Feng Yu delightedly thought. In reality, the reason he had been able to win against his opponents so easily in the past was mostly due to his fearsome reputation. When people who fought against him thought about the fate worse than death that they would suffer at his hands, they would already be fearful even before they fought. Naturally, their fighting abilities would suffer greatly, and losing became inevitable. Today, Feng Yu saw that although Hanli's cultivation was not very deep, the magic tools he had were quite strong. Thus, he intended to use this kind of scare tactic to weaken Hanli's fighting ability and gain the upper hand. Now, looking at Hanli's expression, it seemed as if his tactics had worked. Feng Yu was secretly happy in his heart, swaying on his feet as if he were showing off. He returned to his original position in front of Han Li. The color of Han Li's face was indeed not pleasant to look at, and the feelings in his heart were also not worth mentioning. However, it wasn't because of the opponent's bloody methods, rather, it was because he was preparing to move like lightning that he felt his head starting to hurt like crazy. The last time Han Li had used the golden light brick treasure talisman, he realized that although its power seemed to be much greater than the flying gray sword talisman, in real battles with other opponents, there were actually a few large drawbacks. Its destructive power was truly frightening. If one was hit by it, lower-layered cultivators would be obliterated no matter how many magic tools or protective barriers they had on them. They wouldn't make a big difference. However, this treasure talisman's drawbacks were also incredibly apparent. It could only be used after sucking up a large amount of the user's magic power, and its lack of speed or mobility would leave people speechless. If it was possible to bind the opponent beforehand, this treasure talisman's surprising function would be greatly increased. It would be the best tool for killing people. But if someone were to use only the golden light brick to kill their enemies, it would be an unthinkable thing to do. Unless the opponent's magic power was depleted, using a few random supportive techniques would allow someone to easily dodge this treasure's attack. Thus, this golden light brick treasure talisman was actually not like the flying sword treasure talisman or Feng Yu small blade treasure talisman in the sense that it was not meant for a dogfight. Instead, it was purely effective for generating huge amounts of destructive power, similar to the official magic treasures of core formation experts from the Heavenly Imperial Fortress. Because Han Li no longer had any magic tools that could bind the enemy, his original plan was to use multiple golden blades to slow down the enemy, and then use the golden light brick to launch a surprise attack when the opponent was least expecting it. According to Han Li's reasoning, although success wasn't 100% guaranteed, there was still approximately a 50% chance. However, after seeing Feng Yu's movements, Han Li knew this plan was simply unrealistic. Based on the opponent's display of speed that was not slower than the shifting smoke steps, it would be easy for him to escape from the magic tool dogfight at any time. He raised the gourd high into the air, and 7 or 8 black spheres flew out from it. These spheres flew towards Feng Yu, light as a feather. Feng Yu was naturally aware of Han Li's movements, and thus he stared blankly for a moment. This was because the gourd magic tool was simply too common. Lower-layer cultivators all knew about these cheap magic tools, and almost all of them had tried using such items before. It didn't matter whether the tool that contained the spheres was a gourd or a bottle or a pot. Although the spheres that came shooting out of it were very enticingly called primeval beads, their strength as compared to top-quality magic tools was simply too small. But it was also because of this that Feng Yu began to suspect something in his heart. He didn't wait for the spheres to come near him. Instead, he reached out and placed an ice spear technique talisman into his hand. Then, he raised it, and the talisman immediately became a crystal clear, brilliantly white ice spear, which he resolutely threw to meet the spheres. With a crisp ping, the ice spear flew and knocked away 3 or 4 of these spheres before shattering. White fragments of ice dispersed in midair, as if they were flowers scattered by heavenly maidens. These fragments of ice became a small rain of hail, beautiful in an unexpected way. Seeing these circumstances unfold, Feng Yu finally began to relax, and he once again focused his attention onto Han Li himself. This was because at this time, an azure banner had suddenly appeared. On this banner was the image of an azure dragon bearing its fangs and brandishing its claws. It appeared incredibly realistic, as if it were about to jump out. Feng Yu's experience was very abundant, and with one glance he knew this definitely was a top-notch, high-grade magic tool. He could not afford to underestimate its strength. Meanwhile, Han Li was controlling this flag, allowing its surface to begin to accumulate azure-colored spiritual light. This light was very dazzling, and its strength was truly not small. Although Feng Yu was completely confident in his yellow parasol, his prudent and cunning personality caused him to unblinkingly stare at this azure flag, afraid that this magic tool would have some kind of odd power and could break through his defenses. As for those primeval beads, he had long realized that those were red herrings meant to disturb his line of sight, and so he ignored them. Based on the pitiful destructive force of the primeval beads, even if they were to hover around the yellow parasol for an entire day, it would be impossible for them to disturb his defenses even slightly. However, Feng Yu became increasingly distressed and bewildered after seeing Han Li take out one high-grade magic tool after another. He guessed that Han Li and that woman with many treasures were the same and that he was the disciple of some expert. His desire to kill Han Li became even more urgent. He feared that if the opponent was able to survive, it would cause him no end of trouble. Even more so, the opponent had witnessed the entire process of him killing people and stealing their belongings. If the elder of the woman with many treasures came looking for him, he would have a lot of trouble on his hands. Right as Feng Yu was attracted by the azure flood dragon banner and his killing intent was rising, those primeval beads flew in front of him and ran into the barrier created by the yellow parasol. After making some silvery noises from attacking the barrier, the foremost few beads were easily repelled out. When Feng Yu heard that sound, he instinctively lowered his head to take a look. Relying on those primeval beads to attack me is too arrogant. These aren't even worth mentioning, even. Why is this one so small? It's even colored blue. Feng Yu had just sneered when he discovered a primeval bead that had revealed a blue bead hiding inside of it after it had been reflected. It was only as large as a pill, much more modest in size than regular primeval beads. Feng Yu startled a little. Before he was able to come up with an idea, the blue bead had already hit the ball-shaped barrier. White light. A magnificent, blinding white light. This was the last color that Feng Yu ever saw in this world. His body slowly turned, and then he never knew anything again. In the eyes of Han Li, when the blue bead came into contact with the yellow light, it immediately exploded out with silver light in a sphere a few zhang wide. It noiselessly enveloped the larger half of Feng Yu's body. After this, the white light disappeared without a trace, revealing Feng Yu's stupefied expression, as if he were ready to fight another day. Han Li's heart sank, but before he could move, a light gust of wind blew. Feng Yu's body suddenly collapsed like grains of sand and turned into ash that blew away with the wind. All that remained were the halves of two small legs and the pair of shoes on his feet. They stood all alone on the ground, creating an unspeakably strange scene. When Han Li saw this, he was not afraid. In fact, he immediately sat on the ground and breathed in deeply, allowing his heart, which had been stuck in his throat, to calm down. It was only after using his greatest last resort, the heavenly lightning seed, paired with a whole string of movements meant to cover it up, that he was able to completely wipe out Feng Yu from the face of the earth. But Han Li's expression was not actually one of joy, rather, it displayed both self-deprecation and bitter laughter. This was not too surprising, given that the trial by blood and fire had only entered the second day. He had already used all of his magic treasures, as well as his ultimate trump card he was saving as a last resort. How could he possibly be happy? When he thought about the remaining 3 days, as well as the unknown number of violent people he would meet like Feng Yu, his heart sank again even as he had just begun to relax. However, if he hadn't used the Heaven's Lightning Child, it would have definitely been difficult for him to escape. The flying dark iron shield had reached its breaking point. In addition, considering the opponent's high-grade magic tools as well as the woman with many treasures, he definitely had not suffered a loss. In fact, it would be more accurate to say that he had struck it rich. Han Li began to think better of his situation, and his countenance was revived. He hurriedly looked to the opposite side. But as soon as his eyes fell upon the sight, Han Li's mouth fell wide open, rendering him speechless for a significant amount of time. Chapter 190, black boots because Feng Yu had originally been standing. Apart from that pair of boots, there was nothing else on the floor. The storage pouches Han Li had in mind disappeared without a trace. Han Li stood straight like a carp jumping on water, and then, as if his buttocks were on fire, he hurriedly charged over. After searching for a great long while in the area where Feng Yu disappeared, he couldn't find the slightest trace of the storage pouch. Could it be that the power of the heavenly lightning seed was so powerful? Did it actually turn the storage pouch into ashes along with the person? After Han Li searched his surroundings with his hands several times, he eventually came to an extremely depressing answer. Unresigned, Han Li expanded the search area by several times, but the result was the same. However, he was actually able to acquire the rich girl's small mirror and crystal ball. Furthermore, because the owner had already died, he was able to recover the small blade treasure talisman. When Han Li saw these three items, he thought that the loss of his Heaven's Lightning Child, the high-quality magic tools, the silver hook, and the azure rope, as well as the storage pouches that were destroyed by the heavenly lightning seed, he looked up to the sky speechlessly. However, regardless of what was said after this great battle, he was nonetheless the winner against the much stronger Feng Yu, who had turned to dust. Not knowing whether to consider it a profit or a loss, Han Li was only able to mock himself. When he thought of Feng Yu, Han Li unconsciously looked at what was left at him, a pair of half legs. He could not help but lightly shake his head. He then lifted his hand, releasing two fist-sized fireballs straight toward them. Since this person was already dead, he naturally must thoroughly dispose of the legs to prevent others from discovering this. Who knew what others' troubles could arise? Ping ping. The flames immediately covered them. In the blink of an eye, aside from those jet-black boots, everything else had turned to ash. Satisfied, Han Li nodded his head and turned around, thinking to depart. Boots? How strange. How could normal boots come out unscathed from my fireballs? Just as Han Li took a small step to leave, he immediately saw his mistake and hurried to turn around. He looked toward those seemingly ordinary boots with an odd expression. With a careful look, Han Li was unable to discover anything irregular. Not only were these boots not destroyed by the fireballs, but they also didn't have a single trace of being burned. Furthermore, they faintly released slight spiritual ripples. Magic tool? Han Li asked with great bewilderment. He hesitated for a moment and walked several steps over, lowering his head and picking up the pair of black boots. Light and soft, but they are still very tough. They shouldn't be cloth or silk boots. They seem to have been made from the hide of an animal. Han Li concluded after stroking the boots for a while. Because he was close to them, Han Li was able to feel the boots' faint spiritual qi. They were certainly magic tools. In addition, they were likely to have been constructed from demonic beast leather. Seeing these leather boots, Han Li faintly thought of something. He somewhat impatiently took off his cloth shoes and exchanged them for these leather boot magic tools. They were very comfortable and soft, as if there was nothing there. This was what Han Li first thought when he wore those boots. He carefully observed the boots after wearing them for a while. So far, nothing extraordinary had occurred. Wrinkling his brow, Han Li took a small step. Hoochie! Han Li's body suddenly blurred and appeared over 3 meters away, light as a feather. Imperial flight technique. No, it's much quicker than the Imperial flight technique. Han Li thought, pleasantly surprised. At this moment, Han Li finally knew the secret behind Feng Yu's incomparably fast and nimble movements. It was probably because of these boots that he was able to move so strangely and as quick as lightning. Wearing these boots, Han Li started slowly walking on the ground, gradually familiarizing himself with the boots' performance. He gradually grew faster and faster, finally making use of shifting smoke steps to speed up. Before, Han Li's fastest movements had been able to make his body blur, even causing afterimages to remain. After he put on these boots, Hanli became even faster, causing several identical phantoms to appear simultaneously, all using the same movements and all with the same smile. However, when all of the phantoms simultaneously and gradually converged, Hanli stood there at the center. Motionless, Hanli stood blankly at his original location as if he were pondering about something, but he then howled with laughter and continued to laugh until tears were flowing out. After he laughed for a long while, Hanli bent his waist and flashed with an azure light. His entirety turned into an azure wind and actually disappeared into air without a trace. At this moment, the entire place was extremely quiet. Apart from the occasional rustling of the wind, there were no other sounds. A burst of rumbling sounds suddenly sounded out. The nearby trees suddenly started to break apart in a strange manner from the center. The cuts were clean and smooth, making the trees resemble the flat of a mirror. However, it was clear that there wasn't a single person in sight. The speed at the trees breaking grew quicker and quicker. A short moment later, all that remained of the trees within 100 meters were tree stumps. At this moment, Hanli, enveloped in a faint azure light, appeared with a brow filled with sweat. However, he was faintly smiling and was unable to conceal the joy on his face. Shifting smoke steps, leather boot magic tools, along with the imperial flight technique, actually caused Hanli to become so fast that he was able to temporarily break away from the sight of an ordinary person's naked eye, as if he had become invisible, disappearing without a trace. According to Hanli's estimates, even an outstanding cultivator with the aid of the Heaven's Eye technique would only be able to see a faint glimpse of him by exerting all their strength. If they didn't use a defensive magic technique, Hanli would be a great threat. Currently, so long as Hanli concentrated and a person was within an area of about 10 meters away, even if it was a distance of 100 meters, it would take Hanli at most a single breath to reach them. Naturally, this speed exceeded the limits of the human body. Hanli was only able to maintain the speed for a short amount of time. If he maintained it for too long, his entire body would break down. After all, such high-speed movements were extremely stressful on Hanli's body. However, it was already fast enough for him to kill the opponent several times. South of the central area, in a small area covered with yellow sand, a male and a female disciple from the masked moon sect were using ice awls to continuously puncture the desert ground as if they were looking for something. However, after half a day, they still had not obtained anything. This SL*T, where exactly did she hide? After finding her, I will definitely claw out her eyes. The female disciple appeared to be incredibly enchanting, as beautiful as a flower, but as soon as she opened her mouth, she became sinister and vicious to the extreme. If men heard her speaking in this way, they would shiver. Junior Marshal Sister, let's just let it go. The time that the sect arranged is about to pass. If we don't leave now, we'll be late. The male disciple weakly said. It seemed as if he was very scared of this Junior Marshal Sister. Humph. It's the fault of a worthless piece of trash like you. You couldn't even keep track of a 10th layer cultivator girl. She actually slipped away from right underneath our noses. If this spreads, people will make laughingstocks out of me and my sister, the masked moon sect's twin beauties. But words were just words in the end. The female disciple glanced at the brightness of the sky, and did not dare to continue to search. She didn't want to interfere with the major plans of her sect, even if her status was special and she had a strong backer, they were all relatively unimportant. On the other hand, she was also unwilling to leave this place with her tail between her legs. After hesitating many times, she gritted her teeth and pulled out a blue talisman. Looking at this talisman, she laughed evilly, and abruptly tossed the talisman behind her. Then, she quickly ran out from that area until she was about 100 meters away before stopping and turning around to watch from there. Seeing this, the male disciple complained incessantly under his breath, but he quickly followed after her, not daring to slight her. At this time, the talisman became a huge black cloud, roughly the size of 40 meters. The sky above the area was completely covered up by the cloud, and the nearby temperature abruptly dropped, becoming incomparably cold. In no time, countless massive ice balls began to fall from the black cloud at an increasing speed, and in a very short amount of time the entire area was densely packed with ice balls stuck into the ground. It was as densely packed as the needles on a cactus. In the time it took to boil a pot of tea, the black cloud slowly dissipated. At this time, the entire desert sparkled like crystal. The female disciple opened her eyes wide, sweeping across the entire desert, which was virtually impossible to stand on. However, she didn't see even a trace of anything peculiar. Her face viciously fell, and she unhappily shouted at the male disciple. She resentfully took the lead and left the area. Her so-called cultivation partner naturally followed closely behind her. The masked moon sect woman who had just left didn't notice that in a corner of the ice-all-covered desert, a trace amount of red liquid had seeped out. Unfortunately, its color was too light, and so it escaped the notice of that female disciple. After half of a quarter of an hour, when the dark red had begun to spread, a spherical small bubble suddenly emerged from the yellow sand, becoming increasingly large and increasingly noticeable. In the end, the sand bubble exploded in a raging torrent, and a green-robed female tumbled out of it, a long, slender awl stuck into her shoulder. Fresh blood flowed from the wound, covering half of her body already. Her hand was tightly gripping a yellow handkerchief, radiance flickered on its surface, as if it were not a common item. The woman slowly crawled to her feet. When she looked at the wound on her shoulder, her sleek eyebrows tightly knitted. She raised her other hand and lightly grabbed the latter half of the ice awl, then, gritting her teeth, she pulled out the ice awl. The woman delicately groaned in pain, and tears leaked out of her graceful eyes. Fresh blood poured out from the side of the wound. However, she couldn't afford to wipe away the tears on her face. She didn't dare delay. After a brief flurry of movement, she retrieved a flowery porcelain bottle from her storage pouch. She dumped out some yellow medicinal powder onto her wound, and the blood immediately stopped gushing from her wound. After finishing, the green-robed woman sat down on the desert sand and hugged her knees, unmoving. After a brief moment of time, she suddenly buried her head in her hands and began to cry. However, because she was scared of drawing the attention of other people, this woman kept her crying volume to a minimum. After the time it took to eat a meal had passed, this female disciple from Spirit Beast Mountain finally stopped weeping. She raised her head. Gazing at the uninhabited desert, she couldn't help but shiver. She bit her lip, and then struggled to stand up. After vacillating for a long time, she finally determined her direction and staggered towards the central area. The woman's pretty and pleasant face still had some tear stains on it, but at the same time, she wore a stubborn and resolute expression that didn't seem to match her appearance. This woman was the one who had sold Hanli the golden sincerity brush. However, now that she had been wounded and was walking silently on the sandy ground alone, she was even more beautifully pitiful, causing people to want to take care of her. After a brief moment of time, she continued to onward with her wounded body as she disappeared into the yellow sands. In reality, however, Hanli knew his own feelings quite well. The previous scene had really left him apprehensive. It was apparent from the way those three people died that their killer most likely was someone whose heart was twisted. If he were to fall into that person's hands, he would be a bit more fortunate if he hurried to kill himself. However, Hanli had already come here. Naturally, he wouldn't flee from here simply because of a little fear. Today, in front of him were the true extreme dangers. He would have to summon up his own courage and barge in this time. Like this, Hanli walked through the door, carrying a stomach full of uneasiness. However, he maintained his composure on the surface, as leisurely if he were strolling around in his home's backyard. He had just entered when he was greeted by the scene of a paradise of fragrant flowers and birdsong. All kinds of odd flowers and grasses, as well as many strange trees with unknown names, were strikingly everywhere. Silver chrysanthemums as wide as bowls, blood-red strange trees, purple grass releasing a strange smell, yellow bamboo as thick as a person, etc. These were all rare items that were very difficult to even see in the outside world. In the midst of these precious plants actually was a serpentine path made of crushed rocks. This path extended from where Hanli was standing to a faraway place, obscured by all of the vegetation. From a brief glance, it seemed as if there was no end to this path. Seeing this surprising scene, Hanli briefly stared blankly, but he immediately subconsciously took a deep breath. What dense spiritual qi! The dense, heavy, and mixed smell of plants contained a spiritual qi that just soaked into a person's lungs, causing Hanli's spirits to rise. This kind of paradise, no wonder it could bring forth all the spiritual medicines that exist. Hanli was deeply moved. Boy, have you gawked enough? Who is it? Sounding like a broken gong, a noise suddenly came over, causing Hanli's heart to shiver with fear. He couldn't help but cry out. Hee hee. Since you've seen it already, you can die in peace. This person completely ignored Hanli's inquiry, instead talking out to himself out loud. At the same time, two green shadows slyly streaked out from a flower patch on the side, silently charging towards Hanli's back. Although his back was facing these green shadows, they were not concealed from Hanli's spiritual sense, who was already on guard. His expression grew grim. His upper body had not moved at all, but his body had already automatically shifted laterally a few feet, causing these two green streaks to pass by him both in front and behind him. In the middle of the chaos, Hanli glanced at the green shadows. They were straight, thin, and long, like chopsticks, and their entire bodies were green and had some faint black characters on them. Their appearances were truly somewhat strange. However, in the chaos, Hanli had no time to look closely at them. Even though he had easily neutralized the opponent's attack, his expression was still solemn, and he didn't dare to be careless. The miserable appearance of the three people outside the door was still vivid in his mind. He did not want to end up with a fate similar to theirs. Although Hanli did not dare to carelessly wear a barrier and cause himself slow him down, to test whether the barrier or the strange snakes were stronger, he still had many methods to get rid of the two small snakes. It was only that most of his attention had been focused on the hidden person controlling the snakes, who in the end had never come out, thus allowing the two flying snakes to attack him. Seeing that this person had seemingly decided to completely rely on these two flying snakes to kill him, Hanli naturally would not continue to be polite. Hanli's decision had been made. He flipped his hand, and a flamed serpent talisman appeared in it. Two of his fingers pinched this talisman together, and he was about to excitedly throw it out and start a wild game barbecue. Cloud step boots. Stay your hand, I have something to say. The person with the rough throat recognized the spiritual boots on Hanli's feet, and he immediately yelled out to ask for a pause in the battle, sounding full of incredulity. He stopped the two green streaks with an unknown method of yelling. The two snakes paused in midair and flew backwards along the original route, slipping into the vegetation and disappearing without a trace. Upon hearing this, Hanli knitted his eyebrows. After slightly hesitating, he decided not to throw out the talisman in his hand, but he kept his hand cautiously resting on top of his storage pouch. The evil man peeked at Hanli's current expression and couldn't help but secretly reveal his intentions. In the end, this Yellow Maple Valley disciple was far too young and far too soft. With just a few of his words, he caused his mind to become restless. If a true battle broke out, this definitely would have been a significant mistake. However, for this person to be able to kill that Feng Yu, he could truly be cause for surprise. But how could he see or think that such an extremely common appearance could truly be such a ferocious character? It could be said that with this guy's young age and meager magic power, even if he had several good magic tools, he wouldn't be able to beat Feng Yu's yellow parasol and his great quantity of top-quality magic tools equivalent to the cloud step boots. Still, that guy Feng Yu nonetheless fell underneath this boy's hand. This matter was truly a bit strange, but he did wear the cloud step boots, this was undeniable. Could it be he really didn't kill him but was able to acquire them from some other fortunate occurrence? Zhong Wu pondered about this, but he was still confused. He was unable to accurately judge Han Li's true strength. This caused him to take the initiative to test this with his own hands. If he tried to kill him but couldn't, naturally such a clever man as himself wouldn't take such a dangerous action. After the ugly man remained puzzled and gave much deliberation, he took out his cloth pouch and blinked his uneven eyes several times. With a face full of smiles, he said to Han Li, "Oh wait, I still haven't asked. What is young brother's surname? Do you think you could tell me?" Yellow Maple Valley's Han Li. This wasn't something worth concealing. Han Li calmly replied with an improved complexion. So it turned out to be Brother Han. I previously hadn't heard of young brother's great name. Surely, your distinguished self is one of Yellow Maple Valley's new and rising stars. How much does Brother Han understand about the central area? Zhong Wu appeared very cordial as if he were speaking to a friend he hadn't seen for many years. I don't know much, but Brother Zhong is many years my senior. He surely must know much more than Han Li. Han Li did not know what the other party was planning, but he grew greatly vigilant. He. Brother Han, if you were to trust this one named Zhong, wouldn't it be better for us to exchange our information on the central area? How about it? This is something that would benefit the both of us. After Zhong Wu hesitated for a moment, he eventually spoke his true intentions with a soft voice. After Han Li heard this, he was startled and inwardly contemplated this. Although it was strictly stated in the rules that exchanging his sect's information without the approval of sect elders was not allowed, in reality, it was an act that disciples did much of. Thus, after a short moment, he wore a smile and said, "Sure. After we exchange resources, we will each greatly benefit." Ha! That's great. I knew it, Brother Han isn't some overly careful person. Come. We'll put our information into jade slips and then exchange them with each other. Zhong Wu's face full of pockmarks of all sizes was glowing with excitement as he continuously rubbed his hands. It seemed he was greatly expectant of Han Li's information. When Han Li saw this, he greatly sneered several times, however, his external appearance was naturally in complete agreement. To create a copy of information was a very effortless task. After the time it took to make a cup of tea, they finished making their copies and threw the jade slips to each other. When they each had the jade slips in hand, they both roughly examined the contents. After they confirmed it seemed to be information of the central area, they both looked at each other with a smile containing an ulterior motive. Within this small amount of time, it was naturally impossible to forge false information. However, when the copies were made, some crucial information would be overlooked. This was naturally mutually understood. After this event, Zhong Wu and Han Li seemed to all of a sudden become much closer. Zhong Wu actually told Han Li a few remarkable stories from the world of cultivators. Seeing these two laugh and talk so closely, it was truly hard to believe that not long ago they had been nearly irreconcilable adversaries. It seemed these two were experts in knowing when to retreat. Although Han Li wore a beautiful smile and appeared as if he was interested in this chat, he was truly cursing endlessly in his heart. If you want to chat, then chat. Why would you continue to maintain such a long distance? So long as he advanced a step, the other party would take 2 steps back with a hearty smile. Although Hanli had no intention to kill him, the other party's degree of cautiousness caused Hanli to be dumbfounded. As for whether or not they could emerge again, that depended entirely on their own luck. But what caused one's head to hurt even more was that countless demonic beasts lived on the ring-shaped mountain range, from the lower grade 1 flame mouse and chasing wind rabbit to the peak grade 1 golden light python and ice fire wolf. It roughly contained all of the grade 1 demonic beasts that the 7 great sects had heard or would hear about in the future. Even the 7 or 8 of the weakest of demonic beasts could be easily dealt with by a 6th or 7th layer cultivator. However, if the elite disciples from the 7 great sects were to meet peak-level beasts, their only option was to escape as quickly as possible. Luckily, the last kind of demonic beast was very rare in these mountains, and most of them had become guardians of some spiritual ingredients. It would be unlikely to come across them. Thus, the majority of the more vicious demonic beasts were of upper grade 1. However, they could be easily dealt with under the cooperation of many of the elite disciples. Of course, if one were to run into them alone, a bloody battle would be inevitable. Regardless of whether it was the dense fog on top of the mountain or the demonic beasts that occupied the mountain, if they were to encounter one of these alone, these proud and arrogant elite disciples might reluctantly try to take a risk and enter to pick spiritual ingredients. However, if 2 of them encountered each other, they would have no choice but to look at each other in dismay. Going up and down the mountain under these circumstances was definitely a one-way trip. Thus, the first few groups of disciples that had ever entered the forbidden area only picked some normal spiritual ingredients outside the central area before considering it done. They had never entered the ring-shaped mountains before. However, a few excursions later, a cultivator from the Masked Moon sect had racked his brains and to find a magic treasure called Precious Moon Sun Pearl. This object actually could not attack enemies or protect oneself. Its only use was to emit a strange light that could pierce through many kinds of dense fog or poisonous miasma. It was specially created for use in the forbidden area. As expected, the Masked Moon sect disciples that obtained this treasure were able to shine very brightly in the next opening of the forbidden area. With their backs faced against the other sects, and after getting rid of most of the dense fog, they began to reap the rewards of the ring-shaped mountains. Relying on that time's harvest, they produced large quantities of foundation establishment pills. Then, they broadly recruited other disciples, and their sect strength increased greatly. From then on, the Masked Moon sect was established as the State of Yu's top cultivator sect. However, as the saying goes, there wasn't a wall in this world that didn't let wind through. Chapter 195, The Strength of the Precious Moon Sun Pearl. After Hanli awoke, he did not immediately leave the tree hollow. Instead, he sat down cross-legged in the tree. The spiritual power surged within his body, and his magic power had returned to its peak. The feeling of soreness had already disappeared without a trace, and his strength was vigorous. Hanli had finished inspecting himself, and he slowly opened his eyes. His heart was incredibly satisfied. This was when he stood up and inspected the talismans and magic tools in his storage pouch, finishing up his last-minute preparations. Hanli preciously did not have the time to carefully look through the few storage pouches he previously took from the fully bearded man and his associate. Now, he would naturally search through them once to see if there were any usable magic tools. Truthfully, regardless of whether it was the storage pouches of the fully bearded man and his partner or the storage pouches that they had taken from others, the magic tools in the pouches were numerous, but their quality was incredibly low. After seeing this, Hanli was at a loss for words. Combined, the 5 storage pouches contained 23 magic tools, 5 low-grade ones, 7 mid-grade ones, and 11 high-grade ones. One of the storage pouches actually only contained 2 low-grade magic tools and 2 mid-grade ones. There were no high-grade magic tools at all. This discovery caused Hanli to be stunned for a long time, causing him to sigh with sorrow. The net worth of normal disciples and elite disciples were really as different as the heavens and the earth. This pile of storage pouches did not contain a single top-grade magic tool. No wonder when Hanli had bound the fully bearded man with his earth prison technique, he seemed to have no method to escape. He could only watch as he was crushed to death by the golden light brick. When Hanli thought about the number of top-grade magic tools that the woman with many treasures and Feng Yu had, he felt incredibly helpless towards the poverty of regular disciples. No wonder when other people saw his weak cultivation base, they would subconsciously think that his strength was feeble and could be easily bullied. No one would consider the question of what strong magic tools he might have. Now, Hanli could finally understand why so many disciples had been so excited when they had found out that the Yellow Maple Valley's meeting hall was handing out high-grade magic tools. It seemed like the Yellow Maple Valley that he was part of treated these average disciples pretty well. They were actually willing to use several scores of high-grade magic tools to encourage their morale. In reality, Hanli had guessed incorrectly concerning this matter. Even if the various sects sent out their elite disciples to the forbidden area, they very rarely owned any top-grade magic tools. People like the woman with many treasures, who had top-grade magic weapons from head to toe, were very few in number even among the elite disciples. In addition, most of them came from influential backgrounds. Regular elite disciples would fall short even in flattery. In this way, Hanli, who had 3 or 4 top-grade magic tools on him, could already cause these so-called elite disciples to drool. All in all, before reaching core formation, with the exception of the treasure talismans, each extra top-grade magic tool could change one's strength beyond recognition. While Hanli was in the Yellow Maple Valley, because his contact with other senior martial brothers had been too rare, he was an amateur when it came to the matters of the cultivator world. He still subconsciously believed that the elite disciples all had a pile of top-grade magic tools. This was not surprising, ever since he had had the huge battle with senior martial brother Liu. All of the enemies that he had encountered were owners of top-grade magic tools. This caused him to give rise to the misconception that top-grade magic tools were not rare. Now, although he had realized the regular disciples' lack of magic tools, he still did not completely understand the worth of top-grade magic tools. Would this be a misfortune or a blessing to Hanli? Hanli naturally neglected the low and mid-grade magic tools. He would not consider using them. He then tried out each of the high-grade magic tools before selecting 3 of the strongest and most practical ones to use as backup magic tools. A deep blue flying dagger, a golden alms bowl, and a jade pot. These were the items that Hanli had chosen. The flying dagger and the golden alms bowl were all pure attack-type magic tools, and there was nothing of particular note about them. However, the jade pot was uncommon. It actually was a rarely seen support-type magic tool. The pot could spurt out a green poisonous miasma and surround the area near the enemies, causing them to die from poison. At a first glance, the usefulness of this pot seemed to be pretty good, but in fact it was a magic tool of little value. Any barriers of the 5 elements could all block the poison. It was impossible to use it to actually poison a cultivator. If it wasn't because Hanli thought that this green poisonous fog could temporarily obstruct the enemy's vision and bring the opponent a certain amount of inconvenience, he truly might not have chosen this magic tool. Once he sorted out everything on him, Hanli silently slipped out of the tree hole after estimating the time. Then, after determining his direction, he began to slowly travel on his way. It was definitely out of the question to fly directly into the ring-shaped mountain after the dense fog had been dispersed. He would be noticed by countless demonic beasts that could fly and would be surrounded and attacked to death. In bygone years, there had been a few small paths to safely enter the ring-shaped mountain. Han Li directly headed towards the closest tunnel. The entrance to the tunnel was not too far, and with a bit of effort Han Li hurried to the location specified by the information. After hiding behind some large tree, looking at the limitless fog considered to be as big as the sky, Han Li was truly stunned. The misty fog virtually covered the heavens and the earth. One could forget about seeing the entrance to the ring-shaped mountain. Han Li could not see clearly even one jang into the thick fog. No wonder nobody had dared to climb this mountain before the precious moon sun pearl existed. When he thought about the fact that inside this fog one would have to suffer constantly from the attacks of various demonic beasts that would come and go without warning, he was speechless for quite some time. Since the fog was still so large, it seemed as if the heavenly imperial fortress disciples in possession of the precious pearl had not yet begun to activate their spell and dispel the fog. However, the mountain ridge on this side of the mountains in front of Han Li and the others was incredibly flat, not nearly as steep as other directions. It seemed as if this was the road to take up the mountains. At this time, a few faint and low demonic beast howls could be heard coming from within the mountains. Their sound was mournful and sinister, causing people who heard to tremble with fear. Han Li was currently staring to the point of being dazed. With a whoosh, the yellow shadow shot out of the patch of underbrush on Han Li's side like an arrow. He leaped into the midst of the dark mountain and disappeared from view. This movement seemed to have triggered the nerves of the other hidden people. Immediately, several more people jumped out at the same time and rushed forwards together. Right as they were about to enter the forests on the mountain, however, a few people slightly widened the distance and entered into different areas of the ring-shaped mountains. Han Li had not yet emerged. He planned to observe exactly what kind of people would choose the same route to enter the mountain as him. Chapter 196, Han Li's plan. In a short amount of time, a blue-clothed youth wearing an expression of cold indifference, an elderly Taoist priest with an entire head of white hair, and an azure-clothed gorgeous young woman walked out in succession. They all reached a tacit understanding and chose different locations to enter the mountainous forest. Han Li continued to wait for about another quarter of an hour. Seeing that no other people appeared, he performed a last-minute check on the items he had and, copying the people before him, chose a direction that nobody had yet walked into and silently dived in. What Han Li didn't know was that, not long after he entered, the ugly man Zhong Yu that he had seen just yesterday appeared in front of the tunnel. He gazed at the dark road to go up the mountain and coldly laughed a few times. He released 10 or so yellow dots that flew into the mountainous forest, then calmly followed after them. At this time within the forbidden area, near the broken restrictive entrance, the people that the 7 great sects had left behind as guards looked worriedly in the direction of the forbidden area. Han Li's martial ancestor Li was one of those people. However, it could not be known whether he was worried about the success of his own disciples or if he was more worried about losing his bet. The mood of the other core formation Taoist priest from the Clear Void sect was not much better. Speaking of which, ever since that senior eccentric Cheong from the Masked Moon sect had forced his way into the bet, he no longer had any self-confidence in the bet that they had made beforehand. In an instant, it became apparent he was somewhat worried about his own gains and losses. This was not surprising. The blood of a flood dragon's inner core had been incredibly difficult to obtain. He had basically spent all of his family fortune to obtain it. If he lost it so easily to someone else, even if his attained mental state had been higher, perhaps he would be unable to sleep for a number of years in a row because of heartache. The Taoist priest stealthily sized up the only person in this group who had a composed expression, the young female leader Celestial Ni Chang from the Masked Moon sect. The sole female in the midst of these 7 great core formation experts had not revealed any trace of worry ever since the disciples from the 7 great sects had entered the forbidden area. The more the Taoist priest watched the woman's smiling appearance, the stronger his anxiety became. When he connected this to strange Senior Cheong's expression of having a card up his sleeve when making the bet, he felt the blood of the flood dragon's inner core seemingly fly away from his own pocket and had already become the possession of another. As he thought this, the concerned expression on his face became even more strong. People who didn't know this would have truly mistakenly believed that he was deeply worried for the disciples from his sect inside the forbidden area. After some more time, the Daoist priest finally could not endure it any longer. Taking advantage of a moment when no one was paying attention, he quietly moved closer to Marshal Ancestrally, asking with a concerned expression, "Marshal Ancestrally, the Yellow Maple Valley disciples that you send out this time should be pretty talented. Even so, the people from our two sects might really lose to that strange Senior Cheong. Still, this Daoist priest has some faith in the disciples from the Clear Void sect that entered the forbidden area. What are you trying to say? Does Daoist brother look down upon our Yellow Maple Valley?" Marshal Ancestrally began to display an expression of displeasure upon hearing this. "Ha! Of course not. This Daoist priest just feels a little peculiar about the disciples that the Masked Moon sect sent out this time. I just can't feel at ease," the Daoist priest laughed, explaining himself with a big smile. At this time, the mountain-pushing boar huffed deeply a few times, and in a flash of yellow light, its entire body was covered by a shining white stone armor. In turn, it aggressively charged fiercely in Han Li's direction. Han Li's expression did not change. He stood in the same place and quietly waited for the charging attack of this beast right until it was only about 20 meters away from it. He then waved his hand, and his figure flashed. He had already shifted behind the demonic beast. Mountain-pushing boar. Its truly huge body continued to charge towards the direction Han Li was originally standing in for about 10 meters before panting once. Then, its entire body, from the tip of its nose to its tail, neatly split into two in one moment, and its multicolored internal organs spilled all over the ground. It had actually been completely cut open by Han Li's thin thread magic tool. Han Li retrieved the transparent thread. Glancing at the dead, mountain-pushing boar, he gently shook his head and immediately jumped on top of a tree to leave this location. This was because he knew that soon the smell of blood from the demonic beast's corpse would attract a huge wave of demonic beasts with extremely acute senses of smell. It would still be best for him to slip away luckily as early as possible. It had already been a few hours since Han Li had entered the ring-shaped mountain's dense forest. However, in this short amount of time, he had unfortunately encountered 4 demonic beasts. Of these 4, 3 had been low-level ones, and Han Li naturally slaughtered them in one blow without the slightest bit of courtesy. However, that medium-level flying feather peacock had 5 colored tail feathers that could independently chase after and injure both people and defenses, causing Han Li's head to hurt quite a bit. Luckily, although it was classified as bird-kind, its speed was not actually fast. Thus, afterwards Han Li decided he might as well practice his movement technique, and in one breath he left it behind, disappearing without a trace. It was only in this way that he had avoided this pointless battle. Today, Han Li incessantly sighed as he leaped around from tree to tree as if he were flying. Now, he finally knew the extent to which the ring-shaped mountains were populated with demonic beasts. For the time being, he was still in the outer fringes. The majority of the demonic beasts he had met had been in the low level and were not too hard to deal with. But in another period of time, when he had entered into the deeper parts of the ring-shaped mountain, perhaps medium or high-level demonic beasts would appear in waves. At that time, other than fleeing in a panic, Han Li was truly unable to think of any other tactic for escaping. No wonder the amount of information on the hiding locations of these spiritual medicines was so little. Perhaps the disciples who had entered this mountain before had spent the greater half of their energy hiding from these demonic beasts, and the remaining time could only be used to search those 7 or 8 locations once. However, this was still not enough to guarantee a harvest every time one searched. It looks like my chances of gathering enough spiritual medicines is not too high, Hanli thought with melancholy. The direction Hanli was currently darting in was the concealed cave where the purple monkey flower grew. Based on the information, this location shouldn't have any large value. Because this cave had been harvested once only in the past 100 or more years, the only things inside should be some seedlings close to becoming ripe. There was no way to use them to concoct pills. Chapter 198, Conflict with a Bang. The two high-grade magic tools merely made two small open cracks in the antennas before being bounced aside, causing Hanli to be temporarily stunned. So hard. They could almost compare to the quality of a mid-grade magic tool. Hanli secretly cried out that he was lucky. If it wasn't for him using some small tactics, dealing with this huge centipede would really waste a lot of time. Hanli, seeing that the flying dagger and the golden alms bowl weren't very effective, easily retrieved them. Although this bug had already received a mortal wound, its vitality was too vigorous, and it continued to incessantly roll around. It seemed like it would not die in a short amount of time. Thus, he knitted his eyebrows and displayed his movement technique. With a burst of speed, he flashed over the demonic beast's head and showed no interest in whether the beast lived or died. Directly following the tunnel passageway, he returned to the stone room. Within the stone room, the few purple monkey flower seedlings were still waiting there safe and sound, causing Hanli's heart to be filled with joy. He took out a jade box about as large as a bundle of branches from his storage pouch and placed it on the ground before using his flying dagger to carefully cut out the entire small purple rock along with the purple monkey flower. Then, he leveled the flying dagger and used it to carry the rock back to his hand. It was placed inside of the jade box and sealed off carefully. When all of the spiritual medicines had been completely individually harvested by Hanli, it wasn't until they were all stored that he took a long, relaxed breath. His state of mind had greatly calmed down. He stretched lazily, then carelessly swept over the stone room again to confirm that he hadn't overlooked anything in this place before calmly walking out. When Hanli walked past the place where the giant centipede had received heavy damage, the demonic beast was already lying still on the ground. It was completely dead, and the huge pool of black, poisonous blood from its body caused this section of the cave to be pervaded by a strange smell that made people want to throw up. When Hanli smelled it, he felt somewhat dizzy and lightheaded. Hanli startled, knowing that this was the effect of the poisonous nature of the blood diffusing into the air, so he quickly consumed some pure spirit powder, causing the uncomfortable feeling to abate. He walked about 20 meters away from the corpse of the centipede and stopped. Then, he let out his flying dagger and wildly stabbed it 7 or 8 times. Seeing that it really had not moved at all, he finally relaxed and continued on his way. But having just walked a few steps, Hanli's figure bent at the waist and stooped down to pull out a short black knife. He used 2 fingers to gently wipe off the black mud around the knife's edge, and the short knife immediately shone with golden light. In fact, it was one of the children blades of the gold beetle swarm blades. It turned out that the reason Hanli was able to so easily cut into the demonic beast's abdomen was because in the moment he had disappeared, he had stuck the 8 children blades of the gold beetle swarm blades, blade side up into the ground of the cave in one breath. He lined them up along the tunnel and left the front half of the incomparably sharp blades on the floor. Because he was worried the golden blades would be too bright and would be discovered beforehand by the demonic beast, Hanli used some black silt to smother the blade's edge and turn it black, causing it to become the same color as the pitch-black cave. This way, it would be difficult for the demonic beast to discover it. Thus, after chasing Hanli to this section of the cave, its abdomen had been secretly sliced open by these golden blades stuck into the ground upside down as the huge centipede was so close to the ground and met its fate of being buried there. The poor poisonous bug, known as a high-level demonic beast, had yet to put to use its arsenal of extremely potent poisonous techniques, but just like that it had been carelessly and utterly plotted against by Hanli. This was truly an unjust way to die. Although Hanli had yet to know the centipede that he had killed was a high-grade demonic beast, he knew that even if this poisonous bug hadn't been one, it definitely would have been at least one of the medium-grade demonic beasts. Thus, he was extremely satisfied in his heart that he had been able to deal with this poisonous bug so easily. Now, he took 7 or 8 steps in a row and bent over after every step. Finally, he had cleaned all of the golden blades and retrieved them. Then, he immediately raised his feet to leave the area when he inadvertently glanced at the corpse and hesitated for a moment before walking towards it. As soon as he walked in front of the huge centipede's corpse, Hanli impolitely used the gold blade in his hand and cut towards the head, back, and tail sections, piercing them once. In the end he discovered that its back was the section that had the hardest shell. The gold blade's thrust could only penetrate half an inch deep. Only by continuing to apply force downwards could it slowly cut in. Seeing this, Hanli no longer hesitated. He immediately released all of the recently retrieved 8 gold beetle swarm blades and expended a great deal of effort to cut off the shell of the centipede's back portion. In no time, a few chunks of hard shell a few feet wide had been cut straight off and were carefully placed into his storage pouch. These were more than enough to block one attack from a top-quality magic tool and were good items that were hard to obtain. If they were to be made into a makeshift inner armor, it would definitely be very useful to him. In reality, according to Hanli's original intention, he was itching to cut off all of the centipede's shell and bring it away. But if he were to do this, it would waste too much time, and to the current Hanli, time was the most sorely lacking. Thus, Hanli could only leave the cave with a little regret, and he immediately shot towards the next already predetermined harvesting location. There similarly should be a few spirit sky fruits that had yet to ripen in that location. Meanwhile, as Hanli was continuously following his plan, collecting various kinds of spiritual medicines that were yet to ripen, explosive conflicts had erupted between elite disciples in a few locations where everybody knew there were ripe spiritual medicines to harvest. In addition, there were only these few locations where people precisely knew the spiritual medicines had ripened. The huge conflict between the experts from various sects was inevitable. Chapter 199, Brother and Sister Chin, is masterly somewhat confused as to why this Taoist priest let that person leave. The middle-aged Taoist priest was silent for a moment, then suddenly opened his mouth and spoke. Hee. I am a little bit. This little boy's magic tools were pretty good, even I was somewhat tempted when I saw them. The elder actually spoke very frankly, not attempting to conceal his thoughts. Then Master should get rid of this idea as quickly as possible. This person cannot be killed, the Taoist priest said with a certain amount of caution and knitted his eyebrows. When the azure-robed elder heard this, an expression of doubt briefly flitted across his face, but he did not yet open his mouth to ask anything. He knew that since the conversation had already progressed to this point, based on the other person's personality, a clear explanation would definitely be provided soon after. As expected, the Taoist priest stiffly continued, this person has strong connections to heavenly imperial fortresses Ma Yunlong, it's best to avoid rashly provoking him. When the elder heard this, he was moved and couldn't help but say with surprise, do you mean that Ma Yunlong from the heavenly imperial fortress who a century ago was the person who had the most hope of entering the core formation stage? The Taoist priest bitterly laughed and sighed, if it wasn't that person, who else would it be? I have seen this person a few times. The dustfall pearl in that youth's hand was that person's famous magic tool, there's no way I could be wrong. Thus, this youth must be strongly related to Ma Yunlong. It's best if we don't touch this youth. Yes, thanks for this Taoist friend's reminder. Otherwise, I would really have made a big mistake. Sigh, we had better harvest these spiritual medicines as early as possible. We don't want any other unexpected guests. The elder immediately suggested, finally having recovered to his normal state from his earlier shock. The Taoist priest naturally cheerfully agreed. Then, the two people cut off a purple monkey flower, one from each side, and then immediately parted ways. Similar scenes were playing out in a few other locations, however, their conflicts far less peaceful, instead creating incredibly intense sparks as they clashed. To the side of a certain stone room on a mountain ridge on the ring-shaped mountain, 4 people from 2 different sects were battling while controlling many kinds of magic tools. Among these were a male and female, both wearing yellow attire. They were Yellow Maple Valley's disciples. The male of about 40 years had a scholarly appearance. He held a silver, shining, huge pen and a golden, brilliant book in the middle of his hand. With a wave of his hand, the silver marks and the sky full of golden light attacked the 2 opponents until their sweat stuck to their back and their faces had turned green. Although the pretty, young woman also controlled a blue and yellow pair of flying swords, supporting off to the side, any discerning person could tell just from a glance that her strength was vastly weaker even when compared to that of the 2 opponents, not to mention when compared with her own partner. She was basically useless. Instead, her extremely powerful partner had to save her a couple of times. Their opponents, however, were not 2 people from the same sect. One of them wore a green mask of light and controlled a flying snake about as wide as a bowl and a swarm of huge wasps. The ugly male ferociously defending himself from the Yellow Maple Valley male's large-scale attack of gold light was actually Zhong Yu from Spirit Beast Mountain, who had exchanged information with Hanli. The other person was a pretty and gentle male youth completely clothed in azure. Most likely, he was a Saber Transformation Doc disciple. The 2 red flying daggers fluttering in front of him shot light out in all directions. Just from one glance one would know that they were not common magic tools. These magic tools, which were originally attack-type flying daggers, now became 2 curtains of light about as large as a wagon wheel in front of him, straining to block the silver marks like a sky full of stars against a sparkling silver talisman. Stay your hand, stop fighting, the 2 of us surrender. The one surnamed Qin, consider yourself vicious, the spiritual grasses within the stone room belong to you. The Saber Transformation Doc youth could no longer endure, and he finally opened his mouth to give in. When the ugly Zhong Yu to the side heard this, apart from having a slight expression of unwillingness, it did not actually prevent him from speaking. It could have been considered to be a taciturn understanding of the male youth's words. He returned the flying snake and swarm of wasps back to his side. Hang! How could we let you off so lightly and allow you to surrender as you wish? The weakest female from Yellow Maple Valley said somewhat unwillingly as she lifted up the long hair on her forehead. Earlier, she had been directly ignored, so she had to suppress a stomach full of restlessness. Thus, her tone became very malicious. What are you thinking? Do you still want to kill me? I'm afraid you may not have the skill to. When the Saber Transformation Doc male heard this, he began to screech in aggravation, like he was a girl who had just received a great fright. Thus, the other 3 people couldn't help but get goosebumps. Of course we won't. My 7th little sister was only speaking out of anger. You 2 only need to worry about leaving. I will definitely not get in your way. The middle-aged Yellow Maple Valley male said, his eyebrows slightly wrinkled. He immediately glared at the female to prevent her from further speaking ill words and then spoke to Zhong Yu and the others with a peaceful expression. Hee. Brother Chen really is worthy of being called the Qin clan's prince. Your bearing is much different than those of certain girls. Then we will take our leave. The Saber Transformation Doc youth suddenly became peaceful again, and his voice had returned to that of a normal male, in an instant seeming like he was a graceful, handsome prince. The great contrast would cause people to be very flabbergasted. After saying this, the youth and Zhong Yu glanced again at that stone room, unwilling to part with it. then left that place with some heartache, disappearing without a trace behind the rocks of the mountain. "Big brother, why didn't you kill those two people? All we needed was to exert some more effort, and we could have immediately wiped them out." After watching the two of them leave, the pretty female was finally unable to resist turning her head and asking the middle-aged male this. "Seventh little sister, I've discovered that ever since that incident, you have become somewhat extreme. You want to take other people's lives so easily, but do you know who these two people are?" They both come from incredibly well-known and large families, although they are still very far from our Yan, Chen, and other great clans. One cannot easily look down on them. It's best if we don't rashly start a feud. In addition, even if we really wanted to kill them, we would more than likely not succeed. You should know that although it seemed as if the power of the Golden Book and Silver Pen had pushed those two to an imminent crisis, in reality it was under the premise that they had no intention of running away. If we were really to try to kill them, they aren't idiots, they would obviously immediately flee. By that time, I would not be able to do anything to them even if my Golden Book and Silver Pen were stronger. I would only be suddenly inciting revenge upon my household. The Yellow Maple Valley middle-aged male first used a pampering tone to lightly rebuke the young woman, then explained in great detail the reason why he was unwilling to kill them. This caused that female to suddenly be enlightened. "Oh, right, seventh sister. That brat from the Liu clan, after plotting against you, has never revealed himself anywhere else. It seems as if he really was killed by the person who saved you. If it's really so, he can consider himself lucky. Otherwise, I would definitely make him feel as if death is better than living to let him know the fear of daring to scheme against our Chen clan. The person who saved you, however, is worth thinking over. I spent a lot of energy to investigate the disciples from our sect who had been missing for a few days, but in the end I didn't actually discover anybody who could pose a threat to that brat from the Liu clan. You must know that although that bastard's magic power is not worth mentioning, his Azure Flood Dragon Banner is really a pretty good top-grade magic weapon. Since they were able to save you from his grasp, that person must not be too weak. Could he be an outsider cultivator who just happened to pass by?" The female's big brother suddenly switched to a tender and caring tone as he spoke to his seventh sister. It turned out that this seventh little sister was actually the junior martial sister Chin, who had become as cold as ice and frost. However, in front of this person who was her older brother, she had evidently recovered a bit of her inherent nature. Thus, when she heard his words, her face immediately blushed and she threw a tantrum. "Bah! Why would you bring up that guy? He saved me, so what? I was left all alone in that desolate area, but he actually took my foundation establishment pill and luckily escaped. Most likely, he is also not some good person." Junior martial sister Chen's tone was filled with injustice and hatred. In reality, what caused her to be so ashamed and indignant was not that, but rather it was because as soon as she thought of this person, she would recall that embarrassing night where her head was not clear and her entire body had felt hot and naked. And those two beasts had willfully caressed her entire body from head to toe with their callous hands, as well as the thick male smell from the other person's body were even more engraved in her memory. However, because she was more than a little humiliated and angry, junior martial sister Chin tried her hardest not to think about that incident, instead suppressing them within the deepest corners of her heart. Today, hearing her own big brother bringing it up, she couldn't help but develop a headache, causing her face to alternate between red and white as she sank into contemplation. When junior martial sister Chin absent-mindedly regained consciousness, she discovered her own big brother staring at her with deep meaning, seemingly smiling without smiling. Chapter 200. Young women. The white-clothed young woman, although she appeared to be very pure, actually wore a solemn expression at this time, and her entire body was shrouded by an odd silver sheen. This caused her to appear even more mysterious. What surprised people the most was that the white-clothed males and females following her all appeared to be apprehensive. There weren't even any low whispers, and their expressions as they gazed at the young woman's back were that of reverence. The crafty and unruly woman who had appeared in the desert along with her cultivating companion were in their midst. However, no trace of the arrogant expression on her face could be found. She did not dare to even breathe heavily, just like the other people around her. She appeared to be especially lovable and well-behaved. Suddenly, the youthful celestial woman at the lead stopped her steps, and the entire procession behind her naturally stopped as well. A wide opening was not far in front of them, and a deep, green pool appeared. Within the center of the pool were a few reef rocks protruding from the surface of the water. On these rocks grew roughly 10 lingji mushrooms, which shone like jade and were especially conspicuous. "Is it here?" the youthful celestial woman crisply asked without even turning her head as she gazed at the pool with a great deal of interest. Her voice appeared to be particularly delicate. "Yes. Martial Ancestor, the top-level jade crocodile demonic beast is hiding within the pool. The past few times we came to harvest ingredients in the forbidden area, a disciple from our sect was buried within the belly of this beast. However, another person was able to escape and survive." An older woman flashed out of the flock of masked moon sect female disciples and responded while bowing very respectfully to the youthful celestial woman. "Martial Ancestor." If any of the disciples from the other 6 sects heard this, perhaps they would be so shocked their jaws would dislocate. According to the rules of the cultivating world that determined seniority by strength, this young, fairy-like woman could only be addressed in this way if she were one of the masked moon sect's core formation cultivators. And weren't foundation establishment cultivators and above not allowed to enter the forbidden area this time? What was going on? Looking at the appearances of the other masked moon sect's disciples, who were not amazed by this at all, it seemed like they had known this secret much earlier. "Okay. Got it, you can withdraw." At this time, the youthful celestial woman pompously gave this instruction. Her face revealed a capable expression that did not match with her age. Then, she spoke again to the people behind her, "Prepare yourselves. In a moment, I will lure the jade crocodile out of the water's surface, and you will use the yin-yang pulling magic, combined assault secret technique that you have recently learned, attacking together in pairs. Surely, relying on the killing strength that can defeat Foundation establishment disciples in one blow, this hunt is definitely not a problem. Then, we can go to the next top-level demonic beast's hideout and continue to clean out these spiritual medicines that others had previously not dared to harvest." The young woman was not loud, but her words indicated her full self-confidence. When the male and female disciples heard this, no one revealed any doubtful expressions, instead all answering in agreement. This youthful celestial woman then turned around and opened her purple-red lips. A thumb-sized pink ring slowly spurted out from her mouth. Next, the wind rose. In the turn of an eye, the ring became roughly the size of a forehead and began to emit a low droning cry. It was dazzlingly brilliant and extremely unnatural. Based on this ring's manner of appearing, the light it radiated, and its enormous amount of spiritual power, one could determine that it was absolutely a genuine magic treasure. This caused Hanli to be completely astonished. This was because Hanli had already discovered that the young woman's cultivation base was extremely shallow when the disciples from the various sects had gathered together outside of the forbidden area. It was merely at the 10th layer. Thus, he expected that this woman, after entering the forbidden area, had either already passed away long ago, or she should have been quietly hiding in some location. But today, he had seen her use a top-grade magic tool to fight to the death with a not-to-be-trifled-with disciple from the Giant Sword sect in the central area of the ring-shaped mountain. How could this not cause Hanli to feel incredibly shocked? "Little girl. It's not too late to quit and leave. You should know that I was always being lenient with you. But I trust that someone who doesn't want to kill a female doesn't necessarily mean they won't kill a female. If you continue to nag me, youth and that white eagle will share the same end, the barefoot man said, filled with killing intent. His expression was chilly, and he was somewhat annoyed at this point. One should know that he had been annoyed by this young woman from Spirit Beast Mountain who had appeared from heavens knows where for more than half an hour. His last shred of patience had long since been depleted. If the opponent continued to be unable to tell good from bad, he might actually kill a delicate flower. The young woman's face was deathly pale. However, after gritting her teeth, she said extremely stubbornly, "If you aren't willing to let me have the few fierce young blossoms inside, I won't leave even if I die." Seeing that the young woman had only just recognized who her savior was and appeared to be quite dazed, Hanley couldn't help but be in a good mood and think it was funny. However, on the surface he still only gently nodded at the young woman, then turned around and continued to say to the barefooted man, "How does this brother look upon my suggestion? It would be better if your esteemed self would let this woman go, and then you can go on your closed sun path while we can go our lonely wood bridge. Everyone can mind their own business, and thus wouldn't the peace not be disturbed." Hanley was still holding on to the thought that if he could avoid striking, he would avoid striking, and so he spoke the aforementioned words. In addition, starting a fiery battle with an expert for no reason could, perhaps, also force him to take measure to preserve his own life. It truly would not be a sensible decision. But Hanley had never expected that the barefooted man in front of him would actually turn a blind eye to his words, instead staring with great interest at the gold beetle swarm mother blade. It was as if to him, this golden blade interested him much more than Hanley himself. This kind of action from the opponent caused Hanley to become somewhat quietly resentful. He strongly endured the annoyance in his heart and was thinking of saying something when suddenly the man opened his mouth. This opening of his mouth caused Hanley to stare blankly. "The golden blade in your hand should be part of the same set as the one floating in the air, right? Since it can block my silver sword's attack without being damaged for a while, it should be a top-grade magic tool. Did I guess correctly?" The giant sword-sex barefooted male casually opened his mouth and asked with a bright shine in his eyes. His vigor suddenly rose in an extremely shocking manner. Hanley blinked a few times and was somewhat confused. He didn't know what the opponent's intentions were. However, he still thoughtlessly spoke and replied, "You are correct, they really are a top-grade magic tool. Furthermore, enough. Knowing this is enough. You can attack. If you can beat me, I will not only spare this woman's life, but even the spiritual medicines inside of the stone room will all belong to you too." This person didn't even wait for Hanley to finish talking before immediately interrupting what he was going to say. His face was filled with fanaticism, and he spoke the words that caused Hanley to be dumbstruck. This person was actually a martial idiot in the world of cultivators. At this time, Hanley suddenly realized this point, and he suddenly felt full of gloom, unable to speak even a sentence. Martial idiot means someone who only lives to fight. On guard. The big man did not wait for Hanley to reply and actually did not even release a barrier, instead immediately controlling the silver sword and turning from the young woman's direction towards Hanley, aggressively pouncing over. After knowing how things stood with the opponent, Hanley understood that saying anything else would be wasting his time. Thus, he immediately shook the mother blade in his hand, and the other 7 blades flew out from his storage pouch. They became 7 streaks of golden tips that flew forward to meet the opponent's huge, silver sword without any sign of weakness. However, Hanley did not actually pull out a defensive talisman to increase his own protective barrier. This was because, after seeing the silver sword break through the young woman's silk handkerchief, Hanley was very clear in his heart that this silver sword's strength was truly too shocking. Under one stab from it, regular barriers would break instantly and the person would be killed, not even able to withstand one attack. Thus, it would be better to not add on defensive techniques. In this way he could rely on his movement technique's unpredictability to deal with the opponent's strange attacks. As Hanli was contemplating this, apart from the gold blade guarding near the young woman, the other 7 blades had already become entangled with the huge silver sword. It was as if 7 golden snakes and a huge python were incessantly rolling around and tearing into one another. Both did not show any weaknesses. You're tuning into the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.